Well, Dr. Kenneth Hansen is a dynamic author, lecturer, founder of Treasures in Time, an organization devoted to disseminating knowledge of the biblical and classical world. He has dug on archaeological sites in the Middle East, lived in a politically volatile region of northern Galilee, taught Hebrew on an Israeli agricultural settlement. He also worked with a television news gathering operation in a war zone in southern Lebanon. Dr. Ken Hansen. Ken, how are you?
Great. Good to be with you, George.
My pleasure, too. A couple weeks ago during the fighting in Lebanon, we were fortunate enough to go live to psychic Uri Geller, who was there. He had just witnessed a rocket land not too far from where he was.
Right.
But, you know, Ken, technology now is so incredible. I mean, there he is in the middle of this fighting on his cell phone talking to us with our millions of listeners. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how this works. You're a biblical scholar. You've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've studied the Judas Gospel, which we'll talk about. But what about this, the Book of Revelation, end times? I mean, do you think this is happening?
Well, as a scholar, it's amazing how many correlations there are between the Book of Revelation and other ancient Jewish literature, particularly the Dead Sea Scrolls, which lay out a systematic view of the end time, including a period of strife, warfare that would go on for some 40 years, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here you've got the Book of Revelation in Greek, you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew, one coming from Christian tradition, one coming from a Jewish tradition, and as scholars, we find the golden thread, we find the correlation, and then we start asking, well, why were so many people thinking the same way? These are almost archetypal ideas, patterns about the end time that appear over and over, not just in one piece of literature, but in numbers of them from the same ancient period. And what we seem to conclude is that when things begin to look bad and really bad in the world, then people naturally, there's something in the human psyche that wants to find hope some way or another, and we begin to look beyond. We begin to look beyond the mess that we're in, the world situation, as it were. In those days, the ancient Jews, as well as the early Christians, were directly threatened by a colossal evil empire, we call it Rome, that in fact came down with a fury against the land of Israel in those days and nearly wiped them off the map, certainly tried. So they began to look for some meaning, some pattern, some purpose in it all, and had to conclude that history is going somewhere. It's not just random, it's not just haphazard, it's directional. And this idea of history being directional, of going somewhere, is fundamental to our entire Western mindset, the Western worldview. It's what makes Judaism, Christianity, and, yes, Islam, really all on the same page and very different from other systems in the world, by the way, which don't see particularly any rhyme or reason or direction. So I said all that to say that while things can look terribly bleak, and we begin talking about, indeed, the end, and we've got situations now which unbelievably could rush us toward the end of days by anybody's estimation.
Sure.
But nonetheless, we see reason, we see hope, we see some direction in all of this, and that's what people have to hope for. The blows of history are not random, said the wise man.
Yet every civilization has believed that they were in end times since the beginning of time. Every civilization. What makes us so different?
Well, that's why I say we find archetypes, we find patterns that recur over and over. And not necessarily did every generation either believe that we were in the end times. When we go back into the ancient Hebrew prophets, there was a tendency, even among Isaiah and Jeremiah, even in the midst sometimes of despair, they were looking for a golden age. And we're hoping that the world will improve and continually get better until it brings forth the dawn of a messianic age when the lion will lay down with the lamb. And something began to change, especially as the Roman Empire came in. And there was a different attitude, a different view, and a different archetype, a different pattern. And the same prophets now began to wonder if before that golden age dawns, we're going to experience a time of trouble and trial and woe. They called it Chevlei HaMashiach in the ancient Hebrew, the pangs of the Messiah, like birth pangs. They're going to convulse the world. But as in birth, it brings forth the baby, right? The baby is the golden age, the messianic age. But first you got to suffer travail. That's the archetype laid down in Judaism. And Paul then in the New Testament says, I feel in my own body as though I'm filling up that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And Christians have puzzled over that particular verse for 2 millennia, not realizing this is the Greek version of the Hebrew Chevlei Mashiach, the pangs of the Messiah. There wasn't anything lacking in the sufferings of Christ as far as Paul was concerned, but there's a measure of suffering that we all must endure. These pangs, not of the word Christ, but pangs of the Messiah to bring forth a better age. So even in despair, we can find hope. We have that archetype established. And yes, we've had generation after generation that now looks toward the end. But at some point, you have to decide, is history really going somewhere? Is it just, in fact, random that so many prophets age in and age out have talked about the same thing? Or is even that part of the pattern that's being established?
See, I've always said that end times doesn't mean this is the end of us. It means that it's the end of what we once had, and we can look forward to something new.
Well, exactly, and that's the optimistic angle of it. It's very easy to become a pessimist when you start dealing with the end of days, and this happens. And I know a lot of people, a lot of different religious groups as well, who would just as soon stick their head in the sand, throw their hands up in the air, abdicate, essentially. And it can lead to that. You know, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, so we just stick our heads in the sand and wait for the end. You know, maybe sell everything we have and go off on a mountaintop. And that also is a phenomenon that's happened over and over again. When we look at some of the world events today, there are folks who are tempted to do that. That's where you have to balance it with some of the wisdom of the ages and the sages who said, if anything, do not abdicate. A great Christian preacher was asked, what would you do if you were told that the end was tomorrow? And he said, I'd plant a tree.
I'd plant a tree. I like that. Are you a believer in the end times prophecy of the Antichrist?
Well, you put me on the spot.
Why?
The scriptures speak of this, yeah. But as an individual, I have to say, really, I don't know how it's all going to pan out. There are various. But you believe
in Scripture, right?
Sure. Okay. There are all kinds of scriptures, and this is the thing, though. Especially in Judaism, one isn't told that you have to believe A, B, C, X, Y, Z. What you think, what you believe is really open. And the more we study these ancient texts, the more we realize that there isn't necessarily one way that it's all going to come down, that everybody has to believe. We find these patterns, we find these archetypes, and yes, we find a figure of evil in many of these texts. Sure. But who it is, when this is going to take place, sometimes it's healthier just to say, yeah, history is going somewhere, but the details will work themselves out.
Ken, I see trends. I see patterns. And I'm telling you, over the last year or so, I have talked to so many people who are finding a new spirituality about themselves. They're finding religion. Maybe they've gone back to their old religions, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. But it's happening in tremendous numbers. Are you seeing that now, too?
Oh, yeah. And there's almost an inverse relationship between people's sense of well-being and their spirituality. When people are feeling very good, very secure, then who needs to think about greater issues?
Good point.
When people begin to feel threatened, and all you got to do is just turn on the television today, and it's terrifying if you have half a brain. This is the gathering storm we're looking at. We are in the first salvos of World War III, maybe World War IV, as some commentators have put it. But it's easy at such a point to say, hey, let me reevaluate things myself. Why am I here? What am I doing? When we're threatened, that's what brings about the larger questions.
Is there something a little bit more than just this religions of the world, something more than just one spirituality? I mean, can you tap into this force in the universe to make things better for yourself?
Well, sure. And there is sort of a golden thread, in my opinion, between all the religions of the world. People like to say that, but it almost becomes a glib phrase. Well, yes, all the religions point in one direction. Really, they don't. But if you look hard enough, you can find something that unites them, and that really is on the mystical level. Judaism calls it Kabbalah. We've heard a lot about Kabbalah, and we find that trend through all of them. It's opening oneself to a deeper sensitivity about the universe in which we inhabit, of finding a resonance with the whole universe. And at that point, we see individual betterment. We find ourselves wanting to make ourselves better in some way. And that's the best thing that we can do, rather than, as I say, abdicate, stick our heads in the sand, plant a tree, do something good, and better yourself. Well, I've been writing a new translation, in fact, of the Judas Gospel for my book, Secrets from the Lost Bible, and very, very excited about it. It's going to be re-released in paperback edition just at the end of this month, and folks can pre-order it already through my publisher. And I also have a video clip there, by the way, where I'm discussing the Judas Gospel online if they go to counciloakbooks.com.
Why the interest by so many people nowadays about antiquity, about the Bible, about ancient scripts and things like that?
Yeah, it's phenomenal, isn't it? And I think it does relate to this little sense of angst as we look at the world around us. There's an unsettledness in people, and we begin to look back and we want to find our roots, and that's always refreshing. Just when we think that about everything that could be discovered in the ancient world, all the texts that could possibly be found have already been found, along comes something else that we didn't have a clue about, and that's exactly the case early this year when a text, very old, we're talking nearly 2 millennia old, pieced together, finally presented by the National Geographic Society to the world at large in 2006, called the Judas Gospel, suddenly rears its head. And it took the whole world by storm, no question about it, because we've got here a text that represents a whole branch of ancient, early Christianity, which in fact went extinct, the Gnostics. And this is one of the pieces of their ancient library that we now have in our hands for the first time. It basically gives us an inkling of a special relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and the arch-villain of all times, Judas, and suggests that, in fact, there was a very close relationship between Jesus and Judas, and that the horrible betrayal of Jesus at the hands of Judas was, in fact, something that Jesus counseled, condoned, agreed upon, even wanted Judas to do. So rather than jumping all over Judas, maybe we ought to realize, hey, he did the world a favor, because if Jesus were supposed to die, then here is the individual who brought this about, who actually fulfilled a divine plan.
Was he, though, a willing participant in that? Did he truly get advised by Jesus? Was he told, look, Judas, we got to do this. It's got to be done. We got to do it for humanity. Or, did he do it based on some of the historical perceptions that we've had all our life?
Well, we're told that there was a long, not only relationship, but series of discussions between Judas and Jesus, in which Jesus revealed the secrets of the universe. These are the Gnostic secrets of the universe.
Yeah, there you are. I almost lost you there, Kenny.
Yeah, these are the Gnostic secrets of the universe that Jesus reveals to Judas over an extended period of time before that final Passover meal. So this wasn't something that was just on the spur of the moment. Judas was made to understand the divine purpose in it all, and then only at the end does Jesus say, look, you are actually going to release me in doing this. The concept was that the material body is just a shell, and we need to be released from it, essentially. And Jesus, in order for the divine spirit to be released into the world, needed to be crucified, needed to resurrect, needed to enter into his disciples and believers thereafter. So this is something that had to happen as part of the divine plan. And many mysteries of the universe are revealed to Judas during this period of relationship between them, and they're meticulously recorded in rather cryptic language in this Judas Gospel.
What's your take on the Da Vinci Code, the fictional Da Vinci Code?
The fictional Da Vinci Code, while it's a great work of fiction, as a lot of people have noted, there's not a lot factually that really supports some of the major conclusions. But this I will say, the farther we go back in the Da Vinci Code, the more factual it gets, the more it rests upon. The closer it gets to the present day, in talking about Opus Dei, for example, the Catholic organization, there's really not much to that in the opinion of most competent researchers. But when you go back and speculate, for example, about a relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, well, here we have another Gnostic text that says there was a special relationship there. In the Gospel of Philip, where we're told that Jesus kissed her on the, and then there's a little hole in the text, and we're not exactly sure where Jesus kissed Mary, but he kissed her, right? And so there was some kind of special relationship, and maybe, in fact, this was his wife, as some would speculate. Now, what happened after that is much harder to guess. The Da Vinci Code suggests that perhaps Mary took the child of Jesus and they went to France ultimately, and the line of Jesus ended up in Europe. I have a bit of a different take on all of that. I think that the family of Jesus, his descendants, if he had physical descendants through Mary, let's say, which isn't quite possible, went east, not west, went east into Transjordan, into an ancient city called Pella. And it's there in the archaeology today. Folks can visit it and set up shop as an early Christian Sanhedrin, as it were, and represented the Jewish face of Christianity for about a full century, well into the 2nd century of the Common Era. That was really the true face of Palestinian Christianity. If you want to get to know what Jewish Christianity was like, you got to look there, not so much at Paul. So I'm involved in quite a bit of new research on that angle.
What kind of evidence, Ken, do you uncover to back up some of those theories?
Well, we've got not only the New Testament book of James, but we also have the book of Jude, and we think that both of those are representative of the Jewish face of early Christianity and the descendants, the heirs, as it were. That's a term we can hang on them, the heirs of Jesus, including his brother James, but we're told he had other brothers as well, and the early church fathers, even though this is not in the New Testament, but the early church fathers, as historians, write about his extended family and says he had quite a family, as a matter of fact. The New Testament does say he had other brothers and sisters, right? So what happened to them? Where did they go?
Right.
And if anyone knew Jesus personally and knew his teaching personally, would it have been Paul who knew him the best? Actually, Paul never met him. He met him in a vision, we're told, but he never knew Jesus personally. This was his own family. And the church fathers tell us that during the Great Revolt against Rome, which we spoke about in an earlier segment when the Roman Empire decided to crush Judea with all of its imperial might, we're told that the early church in those days fled and went to Transjordan, settling in the city called Pella. This also dovetails into our discussion of the end time, because they were convinced that this was the end time. They saw Rome coming in on them, and they decided it's time to get out of Dodge. Now, had they remained in Jerusalem and not concluded that this was the end time and not fled, they would have experienced the same fate as the other inhabitants of Jerusalem, and that was extinction. And I'm convinced with the book of Revelation in their hands, which I think actually goes back to a Semitic Aramaic origin behind the Greek. So here is how, as a Hebrew scholar, I'm working with New Testament documents, convinced that this comes out of a Jewish world, out of a Semitic world. They read the book of Revelation just like we read the Dead Sea Scrolls today, which were also apocalyptic and end-time oriented. They concluded, we're in the end time. This is it. We better get out. And they fled. The book of Revelation, chapter 12, speaks of a dragon which opens its mouth and spews forth water. And modern readers of Revelation have no idea how on earth to relate this to anything. Well, if you know the topography of the land of Israel, that's the Jordan River. And it says that the earth swallowed up the water, and that the woman and the man-child came across in safety. So this is an image of Mary, of perhaps the child she carried, or perhaps just an emblem of the church itself, the Jewish church, as the waters of the Jordan River went down in the summertime. It was possible to ford them, to escape to Pella. The book of Revelation is history of the great revolt against Rome and the escape of the Jewish church and its salvation, mind you, to Pella in Transjordan. It's really amazing.
How important is the Dead Sea Scrolls to all of this? Huge.
Because for 2 millennia, scholars as well as lay people have had only the New Testament and the church historians to look at. And while the church historians do tell us about the Jewish side, they tell us about James, the brother, and how they fled to Pella, it pretty much leaves it at that, and begins to focus really on Paul and embrace not only the teachings of Paul, but the authority structure. And they put in place a very rigid authority structure of elders and deacons and bishops and ultimately archbishops, and you had to toe the line or else. And that became the Western face of Christianity. But really, if you want to understand early Christianity, it's helpful not just to stay with Paul, I'm sorry to say. Okay, read Paul, but let's go beyond Paul, and let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we may well have a more accurate picture of early Christianity from the Dead Sea Scrolls than we do even from the writings of Paul in the New Testament.
What are the possibilities, Ken, that there could be other scrolls hidden away there in those caves?
Well, as I say, just when we think that everything that could be found has been, something else pops up. And I was of that opinion early in 2006, that really we're not likely to find anything else. And out of nowhere comes the Judas Gospel, which was actually found in Egypt. But, of course, we're still in the Middle East. It is possible, I have to say. I have to change my own mind now and say, yeah, I think it is entirely possible that something else will yet surface. It's so tantalizing.
Would they dramatically alter our perception of events?
Yeah, anything is possible, yes.
So
the Judas Gospel is now altering our perception of events.
Sure.
You bet.
It is fascinating. How come there were so many books banned from the Bible?
Well, a lot of it had to do with just the plain old orthodoxy, the establishment of an early institution, if we're talking Christianity now, with an institutional church. And that meant you have to have authority structure, and you don't want people getting out of line. Well, along come a group called the Gnostics, who were very strong in the ancient world, especially around the Mediterranean and Egypt, and they had a little different attitude toward things. They were not ready just to knuckle under to the power of the bishops, who said, basically, the world is evil, you are evil, so wallow in it and submit to our authority. The Gnostics said, hey, let's look at it a different way. Let's awaken to the divine spark inside of us. And let's open ourselves, in fact, to continuing revelation. Revelation didn't just end. It continues. And they believe this. So they open themselves to continuing revelations, to continuing visions, and they encourage one another to write them down. And that's why we have now this host of ancient material, including the Judas Gospel and others in we call the Gnostic Gospels that have come forth. But of course, the Orthodoxy hated this. This was a threat to them, and they did everything in their power to stamp out this Gnostic movement, and pretty well succeeded.
Ken, is there, because you've looked at ancient texts and lots of them, and I've got to ask you this. Is there any evidence for extraterrestrials in those texts, interpretations of at least?
Yeah, well, as a scholar, I have to be careful, of course. Have to hedge my bets.
Tippy-toe.
Have to be careful about what I endorse. But what I can say is that we've got an archetypal level in these texts. And what I mean there is, again, patterns. When we see patterns over and over again, while we can't point our finger at one text or another and say, this is a close encounter, this we can say, these ancients definitely believed that we are not alone in the universe. And that's an issue that continues to be discussed in the academic realm as well and in the scientific realm as well. And what I can say is that a purely naturalistic explanation for our own existence and the existence of the universe really strains credulity now on many levels and on a scientific level. By a scientific measure, I would conclude it's impossible. And so the only conclusion we can come to is that we must somehow, in some way, have been seeded. And you can call that God, or you can call that, perhaps some other civilization. But we've got patterns here. We've got archetypes in the ancient texts over and over again. When you see images, for example, in the Judas Gospel of Judas at the end of the text walks into a glowing cloud, just as an example. All right. Now, I can't point to that and say that that's an extraterrestrial phenomenon, but it helps to establish a pattern. And we have other examples in the Lost Bible, as I call it, my book, The Secrets from the Lost Bible. I've got one that's really interesting where Abraham was levitated into the upper atmosphere. This is my own translation, by the way. Levitated into the upper atmosphere, as it were, in a cloud, accompanied by 60 angelic beings. The chariot bore him aloft across the whole surface of the earth. Abraham saw the world exactly as it was at that moment. Looking down, he saw everything that took place, both good and evil. What do we say about that?
Sounds like a craft to me, Ken.
Well, I tell you, could be. Again, as scholars, we have to hedge our bets here. We can't prove things or claim things that we really can't prove, but we look at patterns. And you got to say that this is interesting, and the ancients did not believe that we're alone. They believed that the universe is a far more complex place than a simple naturalistic explanation would allow for. They believed in multiple beings in the universe. You can take that any way you want to, George, but they believe
well, you know which way I'll take it.
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. And this is something, by the way, that got a lot of the Jewish texts in trouble, being a Judaic scholar. We have not only New Testament books that were banned, but we have a lot of quote-unquote Old Testament books that never made it, such as Enoch, for example. The book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees is another one, banned by the Jewish sages, most of them because they placed simply too much emphasis on angelic beings, on intermediary beings, other beings in the universe. We are not alone. And this threatened the fiercely monotheistic Jewish sages who said, at some point now, we start to lose monotheism. You got too many angelic beings, too much emphasis on angels, etc., and we will systematically strike these books from the Hebrew Bible. They did, and they would have been extinct to us were they not picked up by Christian scribes, oddly enough, and copied usually into other languages, Greek, Coptic, and so on, but they've come down to us thanks to the Christians.
But what is your take? I like your interpretation of things. You give it a different perspective. You know, you read the Bible, they talk about the Nephilim, some kind of creatures came down to this planet. What is your interpretation of that?
Well, the ancients believed that the universe was very populated by multiple beings, and they even had a different book of Genesis than we might imagine today. One of the things I've done as a scholar is to go back and take some of these ancient texts and plug them in to Genesis where they might have gone, so you can get a sense of what the earliest Genesis would have been like. It seems that a lot of this stuff was just stricken out of the book of Genesis. Since you mentioned the Nephilim, we've got just one little verse that talks about the sons of God who came down and cohabited with the earth women, and this race of Nephilim was born. And then it goes on and talks about something else, and you're left scratching your head wondering, who are these people? Nephilim, by the way, means fallen ones in the Hebrew. So, who are they? The idea is that they were giants, but where does it actually say that? There's one other random verse later in the Torah that talks about giants in those days who were the descendants of the Nephilim, and that's it. But we've got text upon text of these lost books that I keep talking about that fill in those details. We had a different-looking book of Genesis, as it were, that doesn't just leave it with the sons of God cohabiting with the earth women. It says that their offspring, while they looked normal, grew up to be of enormous stature and would in fact have extincted the entire human family had not the flood been sent to destroy them. And that, in fact, is why the flood was sent. We're told that the biblical patriarch Lamech, who was, in fact, the father of Noah, was afraid that Noah himself might be one of these giants, the offspring of the Nephilim. And there's Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, that talk about the birth of Noah, and he had some strange birthmark on him, and they were afraid that this child might be not one of us. And so Lamech goes up, he ascends on high into some realm called Parwain, some mysterious realm. It's called Parwain in the ancient Hebrew, and speaks with Methuselah and asks Methuselah, who's already up in the hereafter, what about my son Noah? Is he one of us? Is he one of the Nephilim, perhaps? And he is assured that this son Noah is fine. He is, in fact, a savior for your generation. Don't worry about it. But interestingly, Methuselah was the son of another biblical patriarch called Enoch. Enoch was perhaps the first prophet in humanity. His name, Hanoch, means wisdom or education. And the prophecy he gave was in the name of his son, Methuselah. In Hebrew, Metushelach means when he dies, it will be sent. And sure enough, in the year that Methuselah died, the flood was sent. So all these little details emerge about the Nephilim, about this race of half-breeds, as it were. And the flood, rather than just punishing humankind for its wickedness, was sent deliberately to keep us from all being devoured.
And the Nephilim would be totally different from fallen angels, correct?
Well, the word does mean fallen ones.
Oh, it does?
It means nafal in the Hebrew means to fall.
Huh.
So the idea is, in fact, that the angelic hosts began to look down onto the earth and were attracted to earth women, and they left their divine state above and descended, and that's the idea of falling. They came down into the material realm. So how do we take that? Again, there's sort of an archetypal level in all of this. You can read the story as a fairy tale. You can want to take it more literally. You can also just talk about the whole idea of being attracted to the material world when our focus should be beyond, should be up there.
Absolutely.
Like these angels who looked down, right? They became entrapped in materiality and produced horror in the end. If your focus is on the material world, you produce giantism.
Do you believe in the angelic realm, Ken? Do you think it's there, it's part of the universe, always has been?
Yeah, personally, I do. Now, in the academic realm, of course, we don't argue religion. We just say these are what the texts say, right? On the outside of academia, then we can get into our own personal views and ideas. And I, like the ancients, don't believe that we're alone in the universe. Very much not. By the same token, I'm a monotheist, so I have to be careful also not to place too much attention on other beings. The Hebrew Bible allows for angels. Michael is one of the most prominent. We're told in the Dead Sea Scrolls that there will be some kind of pairing or union between Michael and the divine Messiah. So we got an angel and the Messiah in some kind of cooperative effort who generate or emanate, perhaps is the word, the divine judge of the end of days, Melchizedek. This is in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
So we've got all manner of detail about the angels, not only in the Hebrew Bible, but in these extra texts as well. And link it all together.
And the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Ken, were either great writers, storytellers, or there's a lot of fact to this. Which is it?
Well, I think both. I mean, they were clearly gifted expostulators and interpreters. But beyond that, they were a product of their particular day and time, ancient Judea, and we see in these scrolls a real coming together of ideas that we find in Judaism, in Christianity, in Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism and ever fascinating, Gnosticism as well, the Greeks, the Persians. It's like an intersection of worlds, and all of this gets reflected in these people who really lived and were actually recording the ideas of their times.
Well, it is fascinating, whatever is going on.
It wasn't just their peculiar ideas either. Some people think, well, this is just the Essenes, it's just the way they thought. It had to be broader than that. They were reflecting popular ideas that were out there in ancient Judea that since have been, well, because of the church fathers as well as Jewish sages, these various books were extinguished, were suppressed systematically, and now we find books like Jubilees, fragments at least, cropping up among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So one would then have to assume that if the angelic realm is real, then the heaven and hell stories must be as well.
Well, Jews actually came up with concepts of heaven and hell, though it's not something that Judaism focuses on today. Christianity certainly, but these ideas are all linked together. Islam has them as well. How do we understand heaven and hell? Is hell a place of fiery torment, or is this something that's in the archetypal realm, a pattern? More of a Jewish teaching on it is that we create our own hell by our own actions. We create the universe that we inhabit, even on a subconscious level, by even the most tiny acts that we do day in, day out. We build heaven. We create hell.
Do you believe by this creation? Because some people have always said that the earth is hell, for example. We then need, it's almost as if it's a step of a ladder, Ken, because then you have to talk about the devil and whether it is real or not. Yeah.
And again, you got all these different ancient traditions whirling around, and some of them intersecting, especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's why I say there's not just one way of looking at it. People box themselves in trying to create an orthodoxy again, and it was the very orthodoxy, especially in Christianity, that caused all these delicious books to get banned. So we got to watch out about that and just be careful to allow different interpretations. And maybe there isn't just one. Maybe there is a literal hell, but then what about this other idea of us creating this in our own world every day? The Jewish mystics of Kabbalah had the idea that evil is really just the lowest rung on the ladder of good. So, yeah, we can talk about the devil, which in Hebrew is Satan, and it means the adversary, as not necessarily just one figure, but as an office that can be held by multiple figures. And that is, in fact, an idea that appears curiously in the New Testament. Many antichrists have come. That's why I hedged a little bit on the Antichrist question. Many have come. This is an archetype. It's a pattern. And it's an office that can be held by multiple people. Every time I walk into my classroom, I wonder now, who is Satan today?
Will the real Satan please stand up?
Yeah, but exactly. Anyone who is an adversary, who is an inhibitor of the divine plan, is Satan. But even then, said the mystics, it's only the lowest rung on the ladder of good. And segue back to the Gospel of Judas. And here you have someone who's depicted as one of the great Satans in history. But even Judas can be part of the divine plan in the end.
Well, what is your take then on, let's say, exorcisms? Because there appears to be real possession of evil spirits. Are they out there, or is this just, someone's warped the mind?
It's something that Judaism historically has shied away from. Some parts of Christianity have. Back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the most amazing ancient text. We didn't even know it existed until these scrolls were found in 1947 out of nowhere in a cave in Judea. It's called the Genesis Apocryphon. I talked about reconstructing the earliest version of Genesis. Here's a whole ancient text basically about the characters in Genesis. We didn't know it existed, and it records, amazingly, an exorcism. When Abraham is down in Egypt and he passes his wife Sarah off as his sister. We all know that biblical story, at least hopefully. And the Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife Sarah into his harem, essentially, and he's stricken with plagues. The Bible leaves it at that. But here's this delicious ancient text that tells us that Abraham got involved and went and laid his hands upon Pharaoh and exorcised the evil spirit that had caused this plague. So here among ancient Jews, we've got an example of an exorcism, someone who is possessed by an evil spirit because we're not alone.
Why did he bail him out? Why did he try to help him out?
Well, maybe because of his own guilt, he knew that he was the one who was, I'll use the Yiddish word schmuck in this instance, had passed his wife off as his sister, and the Pharaoh is obviously distressed. Why did you do this to me? Kind of a double standard. In the ancient world, men could have as many women as they wanted, but a woman could have only one man. So because Sarah was married, sorry, she cannot have more than one man. This is an abomination for the ancients. So Abraham does this. He acts. He stretches out. He lays on the hands. And we now see this reflected in the New Testament, and it's come down as sort of a liturgical practice, the laying on of hands, people not realizing this is an ancient Jewish practice.
If you had
part of exorcism.
If you had the ability to go back in the time, and I'm pretty sure you would go back to this period here, what area would you like to see? What event would you like to see unfold if you could travel back, Ken?
The Exodus.
Really? Why?
It is
not the crucifixion, but the Exodus, huh?
Everything stems from Sinai. Everything stems from Sinai. Yeah, and it is so hot and incendiary right now, especially in my world, in the academic world, where scholars debate whether Israelites were ever in Egypt to begin with. Was the whole thing just mythological? Was the Exodus just pure mythology, or was there something historical to it? And yeah, sure. I've got my own theories now about the Exodus that link it with something that happened historically and even geologically that are beyond fascinating. And I'm talking about a huge volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini. And I'd love to be around and watch that.
Now, at one period of time do you think that happened, and what happened?
Well, we're talking about the largest volcanic explosion on the planet in the last 10,000 years. 10 times the explosive force of Krakatoa, multiple times the explosive force of the A-bomb at Hiroshima, that would have sent forth tsunami upon tsunami, earthquake, darkness. Now, there's debate about when it happened. Geologists would place it closer to 1600 BCE, but archaeologists place it closer to 1500 BCE, and we have evidence of volcanic pumice from that explosion in, of all places, Egypt. So it certainly changed the whole planet and certainly changed all of civilization and made extinct a great Mediterranean civilization.
Do you think that was the cause of the Exodus? People escaping?
I cannot help but find a correlation between the plagues described in the book of Exodus and this volcanic explosion. It's something that scholars shy away from, but it's too tantalizing. If we're looking for plagues, if we're looking for the sea splitting, for Pharaoh's chariots being engulfed in the waves, then either as academicians we have to just consign this to pure mythology, or we have to say, hey, can we find anything historically that is indicative of massive geological convulsion? And by golly, we have one event of this nature. And curiously enough, if you trace back the biblical chronology, and this is quite possible because the Israelites, they made sure that they recorded the exact years that every individual was born chronologically. You can trace it all the way back, and you come to a date of the Exodus at around 1470 BCE. Santorini explosion, 1500. The Bible says 1470. That's tantalizing.
How do we know that there is a God? Maybe all these ancient texts were based on events that they couldn't explain. They were natural events, like the volcanic eruption, and so they added to it some kind of supernatural perspective and created God, because they had really no answers.
Yeah, well, sure. A lot of fine scholars will say that. It's curious that in the academic world we can talk about basically debunking God, but we can't say much about promoting God. We really can't say anything about promoting God in the academic world. So on the outside of academe, to me, the most amazing thing is that science is where we prove it. Science is where we prove God. It used to be the realm of high philosophy that entered into questions about the existence of God. It's not anymore. Philosophy has devolved into a lot of linguistic analysis. Today it's science and it's astrophysics. And I'm endlessly intrigued by the impossibility of our existence without a divine being, without a divine hand. You don't have to worry about teaching theology in school. All you have to do is point out the fact that our existence, by every scientific measure, is just flat impossible. At the moment of the Big Bang, the universe could and should have turned out any number of ways except our own. It was designed.
Ken Hansen is our guest. Ken, what is your take on Atlantis? You seem to tie that into some of your work.
Well, yeah, endlessly fascinating, of course, on an archetypal level. And we see patterns in various types of literature that seem to refer to some, call it mythical, lost civilization. We have to start asking ourselves, how mythical is it? One of the texts in my book, Secrets from the Lost Bible, that probably a lot of our audience has not heard of, is called The History of the Rechabites, that has an interesting tie-in here. We're told that in the days of the prophet Jeremiah, there was a righteous class of people known as the Rechabites who established an idyllic civilization. And then long afterwards, a hermit named Zosimus prays that he might find these Rechabites. And we look at the text itself, and I've retranslated, as I mentioned, a lot of these. And Zosima says, I started praying, and 3 days later an animal came and bore me on its back for days on end until I finally came to an enormous ocean. And in the middle of this ocean there was a great cloud, interesting, extending out into the heavens. And then 2 large trees suddenly appear above. Zosimus takes hold of the branches, which bends down, lifts him into the heavens, and elevates him over this cloud and passes him from one branch to another and drops him on an island in the middle of a great ocean. Here we have an archetype, a pattern of an island continent where of people of great virtue known as the Rechabites. So is this myth? I like to think that there is at least a kernel of truth in so much of ancient literature, such as the Troy story, for example, and the Trojan horse that people thought was mythology, and now we find out that there really was a Troy. That's only one of these patterns, these archetypes that we find. Another more geological archetype has to do with Santorini that I mentioned in our previous section. And just as I cannot ignore the Exodus link, neither can I ignore a possible Atlantis link here, because we know as historians, archaeologists, that there was a great cycladic civilization, as it was called, that flourished across the Mediterranean in the very early period. This is before Greek civilization, before Mycenaean civilization. It was very well advanced, very technologically developed. It embraced not only these islands, but came to embrace the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete. And we also know that with the eruption of this volcano, we have the extinction of basically an entire island civilization. I've been to Santorini on more than one occasion, and I'm taking a Mediterranean cruise, by the way, leading one next summer. Call it the Atlantis cruise, to go back to Santorini and go down to the pyramids and across the Mediterranean and check some of this out. And
when are you doing that, Ken?
Next May, incidentally. And if you want to log on to my website, treasuresintime.org, treasuresintime.org, you can find out more about the Atlantis cruise, because we can not only talk about it, we can go there so easily and visit this place, which has its own legacy of archaeology. In the 1950s, the island of Santorini, it was called Thera in earlier times, was fully excavated, and it's essentially the Pompeii of the Eastern Mediterranean. Amazing. I have never, as much archaeology as I've seen, I've never seen anything like this. A whole civilization covered, inundated in volcanic pumice, and systematically excavated. And you walk through the streets of this ancient cycladic civilization, and you witness the level of their engineering prowess, and it's just amazing. And you realize this was extinct in an instant, virtually. The entire center of this island blew itself to pieces, and it's just now a great semicircular bay in the middle of the Mediterranean. And I'm convinced that a lot of this civilization is yet to be excavated because it's underwater. And it was linked, incidentally, with the Minoan civilization on ancient Crete, which certainly was inundated by the tsunami, just as Egypt was. And we know, sure enough, that about this time, the civilization of Crete, the Minoan civilization, went into a precipitous decline and ultimately collapsed. So when we read in the ancient Greek sources, Plato writes about Atlantis. Is this mythological, or, and by the way, we're told that he heard this story down in Egypt. Is he hearing about the explosion on Santorini? We have to at least entertain that possibility.
One of the last 2 parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls has finally been translated, thanks to researchers at the University of Haifa in Israel. They managed to put together 60 tiny fragments over more than a year, obtaining fresh insight into a festival that marked the changing of the seasons. But there's much more. First discovered in a cave in Qumran in 1947, there are 900 scrolls which make up the Dead Sea Scrolls. Together, the collection is considered to be the oldest copy of the Bible in known existence. Up next, Dr. Ken Hansen joins us as we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. What's new with you these days?
Oh, my goodness. I'm working on a whole series of video textbooks, in fact, that I've made available on my new YouTube channel. So what we're actually teaching in class about the biblical, the classical world, I've decided to put on video in a new, lively way. They're like mini TV shows with beautiful editing, and we put them out there on YouTube for everybody.
How do they find you there?
Just go to YouTube and type in Kenneth Hansen, Ken Hansen, whatever. It'll take you right there.
Okay, super. Now, there's
also a link on my website, incidentally, which is linked to you.
All right, good. This new discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, dramatic?
Very. You know, I like to tell people, if you're looking for sensationalism, you don't have to make anything up. You know, there's nothing more sensational than biblical archaeology, because there's always something new, always something exciting. Just when you think that everything has been discovered, everything has been written about and talked about, ad infinitum, along comes something that just rocks the world. And here we've got the assembly of this whole series of Dead Sea Scroll fragments, 62 of them actually, pieced together from this whole horde of tiny little pieces discovered out in the Judean desert in 1947, quite by accident. What a story. Puts Indiana Jones to shame.
It really does. Now, for some people who may be brand new to the program, they might be younger people who might not be aware of what the Dead Sea Scrolls might be, can kind of explain to us what they are, who were the authors, and what they mean.
Well, we've got to go back to the year 1947, just 2 years after the end of World War II. The location is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. We're talking about the Great Jordan River Rift Valley, more than 1,200 feet below the level of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the lowest spot on earth. It's a moonscape out there. And right in the middle of that moonscape is this sea. It's actually an enormous lake of salt. We call it the Dead Sea. It's 7 times saltier than ocean water. Nothing lives there. It's dead. And this moonscape all around about, there's just a few desert shrubs and bushes. There are some flocks of sheep and goats, and of course the Bedouin tribesmen who tend their flocks up and down across the western shore of the Dead Sea. Well, one afternoon, this Bedouin shepherd lad, his name was Muhammad, discovered that one of his sheep was missing, and he starts looking along the western shore of the Dead Sea, sticks his head into every nook and cranny. He starts throwing stones into this series of lonely desert caves up in these chalky marled cliffs that pockmark literally the western shore of the Dead Sea, thinking, well, if my goat has gone astray, if I throw these stones into the caves, it'll frighten the animal out into the open. And he hears nothing except something sounds like it's a breaking inside, like breaking pottery. And he crawls his way through that narrow cave entrance halfway up the side of a cliff and discovers this whole series of earthenware clay pottery jars leaning up against the cave wall. And they'd been there for 2,000 years. And he begins to pry open these jars and discovers this big bundle of something inside. He doesn't know what it is, hauls it out of the jar, takes it back to his Bedouin campsite, and they're greeted by these series of ancient parchments on this leathery material. Again, they have no idea what they are, but they've discovered the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're written by an ancient Judean sect 2,000 years ago, back in the days of Jesus and before, written in ancient Hebrew. And that's just the beginning of the story that brings them to the United States and then back to the state of Israel. And not only do we have a series of more or less complete parchment scrolls uncannily preserved, beginning to end, that give us the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible known to exist in all the world. But there are literally hundreds of additional texts. And by the way, there begins a mad dash after the initial discovery to comb every cave in that entire vicinity, that entire region. And who can get there first, the archaeologists or the Bedouin? And the Bedouin come upon one very important cave in particular. They called it Cave 4, cave number 4. Mm-hmm. The Bedouin found what amounted to just piles and piles of fragments, parchment fragments. Now, our friend Muhammad, the Bedouin, found more or less intact scrolls, complete and entire, inside these jars. But in this one cave, they were buried in the floor for some reason. These original scrolls just rolled out flat in stacks, piled on top of one another, and then covered over with sand and debris, and left there for 2,000 years. And some water seeped in, and then you've got bat droppings, and worms got at it. So in the end, it's tens and tens of thousands of teeny tiny pieces, some no bigger than a postage stamp or a thumbnail. And the Bedouin get to it first, and they begin just pulling this stuff out in big handsful into their burlap sacks. What a catastrophe. It's not the way you approach the most important artifacts in the world, right? But eventually, the government of Jordan pays them for every square inch of parchment that they will turn in. And thousands of fragments start pouring into the Jordanians, who assemble them in the basement of an East Jerusalem museum. And now geopolitics gets all involved, right? Because Jerusalem is a divided city, and there's a war about to break out, and the east half is in Arab hands, and the west half is in Jewish hands. There's an East Jerusalem museum called the Rockefeller. And these thousands of fragments end up in the basement of that museum and sequestered for some 40 years.
Wow.
And only a select handful of scholars is allowed access to them. What a story. And then all the scuttlebutt and all of the speculation, what could be in there? What are you hiding in there? And eventually, it all begins to come out. Of course, it's the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle, because the Bedouin, as I mentioned, they just grabbed this stuff in big handfuls without any care to exactly where they were found in the floor of that cave. But they represent some 900 documents, what at one time had been complete texts. And we're talking not about just Bible, but entire books unknown to the world until the mid-20th century. And now we have fragments. And now, how do you piece them together?
And let me ask you this, Ken, because the King James Bible, the version that we all know, came out around 1611. These were found in 1947.
Yep.
Were they different from what the Bible was at that time?
Well, we've got entire portions of the Bible, some entire scrolls. For example, the Isaiah scroll gives us the complete scroll, the complete book of Isaiah, like in the King James Bible. Of course, this is the original Hebrew. So now we compare the original Hebrew with texts that we've had all along. King James, of course, is a translation from earlier texts, from the Latin Vulgate and from the Greek Septuagint, and of course the traditional Hebrew Bible that we find today in synagogues. But now we've got texts of the Bible that predate the previous oldest text of the Bible in any language by not a century or two or three or four, but 1,000 years older in the original Hebrew. And how does that Hebrew compare with what has come down to us? Say in synagogues today, you pick up the Torah in a synagogue. How does it compare? It's almost identical, word for word.
That is amazing all by itself. It echoes exactly what we always had.
Well, exactly. There are minor differences here and there, and that is a study in itself, believe me, because when we do find differences, they're amazing, they're fantastic. But by and large, this is an incredible validation of the biblical text.
Were the scrolls written from word to mouth, handed down over the eons, or might it be the work of a creative writer at the time?
There were apparently a series of writers, creative writers, if you will, and they literally wrote this. Now, how the content came down is another question. Apparently, the ancient sect who composed these, we call them the Essenes most likely, but even that's in debate. There was a sect out on the shore of the Dead Sea 2 millennia ago, a select group of individuals, maybe a few hundred, not more, who lived out in a place called Khirbet Qumran, right on the western shore of the Dead Sea. I've been there many times. And they had their deliberative councils. They had their own sense of government, in fact, to govern and to rule the members of the sect. And they compose a lot of it oral, entire rule books, manuals of their own, not to mention commentaries on the Bible and additional books, again, that are not in the Bible, that we didn't even know existed. Books like the Manual of Discipline and the Damascus Rule. We never heard of these before. And they wrote them down. Individual scribes wrote them down. In some cases, we think a leader, perhaps the supreme leader of the sect at any given time, actually wrote this stuff down on parchment material, vellum. It's the skin of kosher animals. And then they rolled them up into scrolls, protected them very carefully, and deposited them ultimately in those caves.
Now, do the scrolls basically talk about the beginning of time, as the book of Genesis would point out?
They talk about everything. Yes, they talk about the beginning of time. They have specific commentary about how it all came about. They also seem to dwell very much on angels, on interdimensional beings, let's call them, interdimensional entities. For example, they preserved other texts that were apparently popular in the ancient land of Israel. Maybe you've heard of the Book of Enoch or the Book of Jubilees. These books are not in our Bibles, but they were very popular in ancient Israel, and wouldn't you know, these ancient sectarians preserved those texts, and we've got fragments of them also among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest copies of Enoch, of Jubilees in all the world. I mention it because those books also seem to dwell and focus on supernatural entities, on the beginning of time, and both of them introduce a solar calendar, which is unbelievable because Judaism is all about a lunar calendar. But we're told that the angels, we believe the angel of the presence, of the divine presence, we're told, dictated this Jubilee calendar to none other than Moses. And that's what we find in the Book of Jubilees.
Do they talk about Satan?
Oh, my, yes. And they dwell also on light and darkness, good and evil. I tell people, if you want to understand the mentality of the Dead Sea Scrolls, go watch Star Wars. That's it. In a nutshell, I mean, you've got the Force, you've got the dark side, you've got Darth Vader out there, and maybe a little bit of Tolkien imagery as well. How about Sauron, right? Satan is the adversary or the enemy in the Hebrew language. And yes, there's great combat. There's a great war between the sons of light, who apparently are the members of this secret society, versus the sons of darkness at the end of the age. So at the same time, they're fascinated by the beginning of all things, but they're also completely fascinated by the end of days. We have an entire Dead Sea Scroll called the War Scroll, or the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It sounds eerily like a certain New Testament book, the book of Revelation, of course. It describes a series of 7 great battles at the very end of the age. 3 will be won by the sons of light, 3 will be won by the sons of darkness, and the final battle will be won by the Almighty with an army of angels who will descend at the very last hour and win it for the good guys, the force, if you will.
When do you think the scrolls were written, and how long? What time? What kind of time period?
Well, over a period of probably a good 2 centuries at least.
200 years, all right.
Yeah, it's a series of them. 900 assorted documents. We think that the earliest of these scrolls go back as far as the 2nd century BCE, or before the Common Era, we say in Judaic studies. It's the same as BC. 200 years BCE, and extend all the way into the 1st century, and that's the days of Jesus, right? So this is quite a time span that we're talking about, but very volatile days and actual seminal days when it comes to the development of what we think of as the 3 dominant cultures of the world today: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. All can be rooted back to this very important time period that surprisingly few people know very much about.
Amazing, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Amazing. That's all you can say. You don't need to make anything up, and there's always something new. So here we have these fragments pieced together, 62 tiny little pieces. Now, the fragments that were sequestered for some 4 decades finally came out slowly. They were leaked, which is kind of delicious in itself, isn't it? We love leaks, don't we? Usually we think of government leaks, CIA or whatnot, FBI. Imagine Dead Sea Scroll leaks. But it happened, and certain people got their hands on at least portions of this hoard of fragments in this museum, right? And leaked them, even published them. Then there were lawsuits. The scholars who were writing Herd said, well, you have violated copyright on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you imagine? By leaking these. And there were lawsuits. Seriously.
Wow. Ken, are there many scrolls still either not deciphered or read that are still in their containers?
Well, presumably, this is one of the last 2 undeciphered Dead Sea Scrolls. So this entire hoard of thousands and thousands of fragments that slowly leaked out has, in fact, been deciphered, most of them even translated, although it doesn't do much good to translate a tiny scrap here and a tiny scrap there if you don't know what order they go into. So it's out there now, in spite of all the lawsuits. We've got one more that these particular scholars from Haifa University, Eshbal Ratzon and Yonatan Ben Dov, are still working on, trying to piece together. But, I hesitate to say that anything is finally complete, finally all done, all undeciphered, because as soon as you make a statement like that, something else comes to light. You know what I mean?
So I was reading part of the Deciphering, and they talk about the Olive Harvest Festival and the Feast of Wine. Big deal. What does this mean?
Yeah, well, to folks who are not too familiar with the ancient society of that day, that might not mean much. But to those of us who study this, to the scholarly community, we know pretty much what ancient Judaism looked like. And in some respects, it was all over the place. It was not like Judaism today that is completely codified, and you have exact festivals, exact times. We know exactly when Rosh Hashanah is, when Yom Kippur is, when Passover is, etc. That's traditional Judaism that is observed to this day, obviously. But in ancient times, you've got this renegade sect. And again, I'm going to call them the Essenes, though I have to be careful because not all of my colleagues agree that these were the Essenes. We can also just call them the Dead Sea sect.
And wasn't Jesus an Essene?
Well, that's also in debate. I'm convinced he knew of the Essenes and knew them very well, and he even knew the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if we know the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm convinced Jesus was even quoting certain portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, I think he actually had a feud going with them. I think that he did not like them because they were so exclusive. They were off among themselves, and they had these festivals that are not in traditional Judaism, that we didn't even know about. The Festival of New Wine, what is that? The Festival of New Oil, a solar calendar, when today, down to the present, Judaism uses a lunar calendar. That's why Yom Kippur does not fall on the same day of our calendar every year. It differs. It's according to the moon. But this sect, apparently taking it from these intermediary beings, these angels, way back to the Book of Jubilees, had fabricated a 364-day solar calendar upon which these new festivals were inserted. New wine. What is the Feast of New Wine? Well, we hear about new wine even in the New Testament, even in the Book of Acts. Apparently, the followers of Jesus are drinking new wine, which is essentially right after the grape harvest. There hasn't been time for it to really ferment. So it's either grape juice or a very lightly fermented wine. And the joke was that we kind of miss in the Book of Acts is they say these men are drunk on new wine. They had been drinking this new wine so much. It's said that the ancient world lived on wine and olive oil. And even the ancient Romans used to say, life is wine. So you can imagine how radical it was to be consuming only new wine. And apparently there was such a fixation on ritual purity that they would not even trust wine except it was completely new, or olive oil unless it was completely new. And maybe that has to do also with their sense of apocalypticism. I'm drawn, for example, to the book of Isaiah, where God is saying, I have trodden the winepress alone. They were talking about new wine here. I have trodden them in my anger. And that, by the way, is the source of our battle hymn of the Republic. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored.
Good point. Yeah, you're right.
There's an apocalypticism all over these scrolls, and I call it loaded language. We shouldn't be cavalier about anything that we read in these documents. Every word has another sense, another link to something else. It's loaded and it's coded as well. This was written in a code. And then what about oil? Oil. There was a special feast of newly pressed oil, and that was all that they would use, because otherwise its purity could not be guaranteed. And even that draws us to some apocalyptic imagery. The time at which this festival was to be celebrated was just 2 weeks before the Feast of Trumpets, or we call it today Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the year. And that's when the oil had to be manufactured. And it started with the olive tree. It had to be shaken. It had to be beaten, a certain shaking and beating of the olive tree that, to me, it symbolizes a lot of what? Shaking, quaking, earthquakes, natural disasters. The ancient Hebrew prophet Haggai said, "Yet once more will I shake the heavens and the earth." This is powerful stuff. So there's a double meaning. It's both a festival, but it's also a sense of foreboding that the end is near. And this was all over the mentality of this ancient sect.
Ken, let's go back, and I want you to, you're going to have to create this, but when the Essenes or whomever did the Dead Sea Scrolls, why did they start? Why did they do it?
They felt a need to separate from the rest of their society. And it had to do with this sense of purity. We're going to live a purified life, hyper-purity, as it were, because we are convinced we're at the very end of time. And we have to prepare ourselves. So they quoted this passage also from the book of Isaiah. It says, I'll say it in the original Hebrew, Kol Koreh, a voice is calling, Bamidbar panu derech Hashem. in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Yashruba Araba Mesilale Eloheinu. In the dry place straighten his path. They took that poetic passage from Isaiah literally, and they felt we've got to literally go out into the dry place, out into the desert, out into the wilderness in order to prepare the way of the Lord. Sounds a bit like John the Baptist, who I do think at one point was a member of this sect. And so they went out there to create an alternate society, eagerly anticipating the Messianic age to come.
Do you believe the writings are real? And when I mean real, I mean what they contain.
How do we define real?
Yeah.
They had certainly powerful spiritual experiences, metaphysical experiences. Today we'd call them paranormal. Our paranormal experience is real. It's interesting as a scholar because scholars rarely go into what the writers were actually experiencing, and I think that's a shame. We just look at the texts and imagine that they must have just contrived and manufactured. They were just writing stories, and who knows what they were experiencing. We don't go there. It's a shame because they must have had powerful metaphysical, quote-unquote, paranormal experience. And were those experiences real? Who's to say? Who's to say? Maybe so.
Well, since you've been doing your research into this area, and there are others who do it too, is there a consensus here?
Is there a consensus about what they were experiencing?
Yes.
No. In academics, let me tell you, George, there's no consensus about anything. Who the writers were, when they were written, et cetera, et cetera. There's theories on top of theories. Some even have suggested that these were the earliest Judeo-Christian writings. So the thinking is all over the place. But we need to take it seriously. We need to ask serious questions. What was going on in their heads? What kind of experiences were they having? They talk about angels. They talk about, Jacques Vallée would call them interdimensional beings. And I love Jacques Vallée, a real scientist who looks at the whole, of course, UFO phenomenon, but he sees traces of similar type of phenomena in different societies all over time, all through history, and written about, in fact. And he says there's got to be something to this. And that's where I think we need to be, beyond just literary scholarship.
Well, there's no doubt about it, Ken, but the whole thing is not only perplexing, it's exciting, isn't it?
It's exciting. And I also, while we're on the subject, should share a certain theory that I espouse and I agree with, that going way back into ancient Israel, there was a renegade group of priests. You know, back to King David's time. What people probably don't realize, King David appointed 2 high priests, 2 of them. One of them ends up the power broker who actually anoints David's son Solomon. His name is Zadok, and he starts a whole priestly dynasty who are in charge. They're the powerful ones. Ultimately, way down centuries later, they morph into this group called the Sadducees. But what about this other priest who was not the lucky one? David appointed 2. This other priest, his name was Abiathar. Some may have heard of him reading the Old Testament. He goes off to a city in the north of Israel called Anathoth. Well, that happens to have been the birthplace of a prophet everybody's heard of called Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is a priest. He's in constant conflict with the Israelite priesthood. In fact, he's thrown into a pit, we read, because he prophesies doom against the kingly dynasty in those days. His line of, let's say, an anti-priesthood continues to the north of Israel and becomes this group that I call, and some others call, the Visionaries. And I love this. This is a scholarly term, the Visionaries, because they cultivated spirituality. They were a disenfranchised group of priests who were felt alienated and marginalized, but they were looking to divine visions, as it were, and they cultivated spirituality, and I believe also what we'd call paranormal experience. And their group continued on and morphed into a group of ancient Hasidic Jews. We think of modern Hasidic Jews. We don't realize that there were ancient ones. They didn't wear black coats and side curls, but they were true ancients. They were part of this umbrella visionary group who ultimately gave us the Essenes, also gave us the Judeo-Christians, the Jesus movement, and other groups. We call them the Enochians, who espoused Enochic Judaism, the book of Enoch that talks all about the heavenly watchers. And my goodness, it's a whole folklore and amazing stuff.
Are the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Revelations one and the same? Are the Book of Revelations in those scrolls?
Actually, the Dead Sea War Scroll predates the Book of Revelation.
They do.
By at least a century. Revelation came down to us in Greek, although some of us look at that Greek text and think, gee, it sure looks Semitic, as if it were originally written in Aramaic, which is a kindred language to Hebrew. And then that got lost, and what came down to us was Greek. But we can go yet a century earlier, and we've got this Dead Sea War Scroll, also very apocalyptic. So they're cut from the same cloth, from this visionary cloth that I was talking about, that is sort of an anti-establishment group, cultivating spirituality, metaphysical experience.
But it was all about, it was the same. So what does that tell you? Where they echo things that are so similar?
Yeah, the cloth was the same. You could trace it all the way back to this renegade priest in the days of King David, marginalized, cut out from the power structure. And so they cultivate what they can. They don't have power. They don't control the temple. They cultivate metaphysics. They cultivate the paranormal. That's the cloth from which all these groups are cut, and all of them in tension with the theocracy of the day.
It is truly one of the most remarkable discoveries, I think, of modern times, even though it started in 47.
One of the most remarkable discoveries ever, because we've got an entire library here of ancient documents, and this, the newest. Now, we have databases of these fragments. I have them on my own computer that I work with all the time, where we have, actually, it's done by computer. You can actually look at each fragment, and we've got the original Hebrew writing there. But the task has always been to put them together. So when you get this new text, this new scroll that's been combined from these documents, that's a remarkable thing and gives us so many insights. This calendar alone is remarkable because it may help us to resolve a problem with Jesus and the Last Supper.
And what was the problem?
The problem is that if Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover meal, which most people think it probably was, well, when did he take the Passover meal? Well, it was Thursday night, correct? Because he was crucified on Friday. And the bodies had to come down from the crosses, we're told, because it was the preparation day for Passover, which just happened to fall on a Saturday that year. Well, wait a second. When is the Passover meal supposed to be taken? The night of the Passover, the eve of the Passover, which would have been Friday night. That means Jesus took it a day too early. Why is that? I have a good friend and a colleague, a Judaica scholar, who's fascinated with Jesus research, and he lives out in suburbs of L.A. He's a marvelous fellow who came to our university and argued strongly that Jesus' Passover meal, it was not a Passover meal. This Last Supper couldn't have been because it was too early. Well, I'd like to resolve that problem, because what if this calendar that we now see revealed in this new document, this solar calendar, not lunar, were out there in the general population? Is it possible that Jesus and his disciples were going according to the solar calendar? In the solar calendar, no Jewish holidays fell on a Saturday. None of them. They fell on a Wednesday.
Huh. Well, we always thought they were Saturdays, didn't we?
Well, according to the lunar calendar, it changes every year.
Yeah.
Passover can be any day, but on that particular year, if we read the Gospels, the traditional Jewish calendar put it on a Saturday. If Jesus were using the alternate calendar, the Dead Sea solar calendar, which I think was much wider than just the Dead Sea, he in fact could have had his Last Supper as a Passover meal following the solar calendar earlier.
Ken, throughout the history of mankind, we have always dabbled with the thought of what happens when we die. These texts, what do they say, if anything, about NDEs, near-death experiences?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, it's like giving us a backstory to what the Bible itself tells us, which is, as I mentioned, pretty sparse. It doesn't mince words in terms of a text. The Bible just gives us a running story and then moves on. But then you wonder, what about some of the other experiences these biblical characters must have had? What was it like when they died, for example? And we've got multiple such stories from Adam, for example, who is on his deathbed, as it were, facing his own demise, and he sends his son Seth to go back to the Garden of Eden, which they had been expelled from, in order to take some anointing oil from the tree of life and bring it to him to soothe his wounds. These kind of stories just never made the cut of the Bible, and yet they convey to us the most remarkable compassion, even in death, as if to tell us that without pain and suffering and even death, we wouldn't be fully human. So rather than to wince from pain and to recoil from the idea of death, this is something that ultimately we should welcome. But beyond that, we've got some very curious experiences from the stories about the patriarchs. Abraham, that I mentioned earlier, who is taken up into the heavens. And here you have sort of a combination NDE and ET experience. Again, that's why I like this concept of archetypes, where whatever these experiences are, they seem to be fused together. He's brought up and given a preview of what the next life will be. And it's not the only one. We've got the testament of Isaac. That's Abraham's son. And he's told by the angel, again, it's an angel, Michael, about his approaching death, and he goes up into the heavens, and he has an experience of a life after this life. It's remarkably like a lot of the near-death experiences that we see today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And even more remarkable from my standpoint as a literary scholar is that these people are changed by it. When you talk to people today who have an NDE, invariably, it's not just the experience that's remarkable, it does something to them. They have no fear of death. They're changed individuals. And it invariably, they say, I wish I didn't have to come back. But Isaac, for example, he comes back with basically a series of admonitions, sort of a living will that he passes on to his own family on how you should live well. This has changed him. Don't kill with the sword, he tells them. Don't kill with the tongue. Watch what you say. Don't be angry after sunset. Don't accept too much praise. Don't rejoice at your enemy's downfall. And, oh, yes, he prophesies the Messiah.
Now, let's get back to the, if we can, the revelations from the angel Gabriel, if it was an angel, of course. What did they say?
Yeah, I so love talking about this new Gabriel revelation and the tablet. Again, some claim that it's a forgery because, after all, it's written on stone and not on parchment. But we have to be careful about becoming too skeptical in the scholarly community, and I think that often destroys some of the inherent curiosity that we have when we read here about an apocalyptic vision of the archangel Gabriel. Gabriel is the Hebrew word that means a mighty one of God, and Gabriel is communicating, if this thing is not a forgery, some remarkable concepts and ideas, because it is clearly referencing a period BC, right, before Jesus was born even, and yet it's talking about some character who will die. And then it says in the Hebrew from this tablet
Leshloshet yamim chaye, in 3 days live again.
That is amazing.
And this is BC, if this thing is not a forgery.
All right. Yet the Jewish faith today and has historically disallowed the fact that Jesus was Messiah and that he rose from the dead.
Well, yes, but my new book actually addresses a lot of these fine points. It's been assumed by most scholars, and certainly most Christian scholars for the last couple of millennia, that these ideas were not common to the Jewish faith, that they were really unique in history, and
right.
certainly unique to Christianity. If things like the Gabriel Tablet are true and they're not forgeries, then we know that these ideas were not just the domain of a new religion that developed. These were right in the heart and soul and bosom of ancient Judaism itself. And as a scholar, I'm fascinated. Again, I'm a scholar of Judaic studies, and I'm fascinated by early Christianity within the Jewish faith. And I'm convinced that this movement was enormous, and it was thoroughly Jewish, and it even tended to be quite apocalyptic. It was caught up right on the cusp of this catastrophe of revolution against the Roman Empire. We've got a Dead Sea Scroll that looks a whole lot like the book of Revelation, and yet it is written in Hebrew, and it predates the book of Revelation by at least 100 years. And this is remarkable.
Now, is there any way that those who wrote the book of Revelation, the Gospel, that they would have known about these other texts?
I'm sure. The more I study this, the more I research this on a scholarly level, the parallels are too uncanny to be just coincidental. There are common themes. We love that word archetypes all through this literature that talk in specific terms. Sure, the early Judeo-Christians, we have to call them, had to have been aware of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some even think that there was a direct link with whoever wrote the scrolls and early Christianity. One scholar, a colleague of mine, thinks that the mysterious teacher of righteousness in the Dead Sea Scrolls was, in fact, the apostle we call James, and that the scrolls do, in fact, represent the face of early Judeo-Christianity.
Now, who wrote the book of Revelation? Was it John or all of them?
Well, as with everything else, it's highly contended. I think that the book of Revelation has very early roots, that it did derive
beyond John.
From pardon?
Way beyond John, I bet.
Well, from the original disciple called John the Beloved. And that is considered, what can we call it, a very traditional, conservative view among a lot of modern scholars. But I think there's material to support that this is a very early text, that this beloved disciple probably communicated this tradition, this material, to somebody else, probably lived in Ephesus, who then set it down ultimately in Greek. So you have a Greek overlay of this very early disciple who knew Jesus personally and who communicated these messages, not in Greek. I'm convinced, among a few others, that the original text of the book of Revelation was Semitic, Hebrew, perhaps Aramaic. These are kindred Semitic languages that then was transmitted into Greek. And if you're dealing now with a Semitic text, you even have a closer link with the Dead Sea Scrolls and their very curious scroll called the War Between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, apocalyptic Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls that dovetails with the book of Revelation and yet predates it.
What do they say or write about evil, the devil? Does that ever come up, Satan?
Oh, yes. They believe that the universe is dense with intelligence, but that there is a dark side of the force, if you will. If we're going to go to the non-terrestrial type of paradigm, we can think of it that way. It's very Star Wars-ish. In fact, when I teach my students, I always bring in Star Wars analogies. You've got this power in the universe that you can tap into either for good or for evil. And sure enough, evil is said to abound. They saw it in the Roman Empire. and they were wary enough to communicate hidden messages. And in the book of Revelation, we find cryptic messages. It's like a code that actually encourages this Judeo-Christian movement to flee the city, to get out of Jerusalem just at the right time, and I'm convinced to head across the Jordan River to the east, avoiding the flood, and ultimately settling in an ancient site in Jordan called Pella. And we have it in the archaeology today. They succeeded, I'm convinced, and continued to live there for centuries into the Common Era as a Jewish Christian movement. So we have to be careful when we conceive that the Jewish people just rejected Jesus as the Messiah or rejected these ideas of Christianity. They were all Jews, his followers, at least in the East. They were all of them Jews. And these concepts, while not held in Judaism today, were apparently alive and well in the ancient world.
Do the documents specifically talk about Jesus, or do they just allude to him?
They allude to him.
Yeah.
They allude to him. But when you have, for example, in this Gabriel revelation, this messianic language that talks about a Messiah who appears to be a son of Joseph. And that's really curious, because there is a cryptic passage in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. This is Jewish religious literature read to this day that talks about the Messiah, son of Joseph. And then just goes on to another topic, and all kinds of speculation as who is this Messiah, son of Joseph? And of course, this is Jewish literature. Are we getting Christian here? But perhaps there was a Jewish tradition that there would be a messianic character born to one named Joseph, as we know Jesus was. And then we find this other interesting word in this same Gabriel Tablet that I mentioned earlier in our discussion. The word is Merkava, and I'm reading from the Gabriel Tablet. This is their Merkava. Merkava. This is that word we translate as chariot. It was in a Dead Sea Scroll that we read earlier, the Song of Sabbath Sacrifices. Here it is, the same word in this newly discovered Gabriel revelation.
Why can't we take all these texts, the Bible, and find historical references to them physically, such as Noah's Ark up there on Mount Ararat or wherever it is? Why can't we use this as a roadmap to go find these things? If they found Noah's Ark up there on Mount Ararat, wouldn't that tell you that the Bible is accurate? It would to me.
If they found the Ark of the Covenant, for example?
Well, that too.
Sure. Well, there have been attempts, even from the very beginnings of biblical archaeology as a science, which began formally in the 19th century. One great archaeologist, William Foxwell Albright, used to boast that he would take a Bible in one hand and his spade in the other as he would go through the archaeology, and absolutely saw archaeology as confirming details of the biblical text. Now, in more recent years, Albright and his protégés have gotten trounced by more revisionist scholars and archaeologists who are known as minimalists. They're trying to prove that just the opposite, nothing can be substantiated by archaeology, and that nothing in the Bible actually occurred. Almost it's like if it happened in the Bible, it must not be true.
A storybook.
Sure, and even worse, because this is deliberately contrived to mislead people. But, it's like a pendulum swinging. It goes so far over in that one direction, and now, lo and behold, it's beginning to come back. And there are some staggering things that are coming forth in the archaeology. Only recently, we got another major find where there is an altar that has been discovered archaeologically on Mount Ebal, or Ebal, that Joshua supposedly set up and erected. after the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, way back after the Exodus. Well, this story has just been laughed to scorn as total contrivance. Why, this is as historical as Tales of King Arthur, is what a lot of modern scholarship has declared. And then out of nowhere, you've got just recently a spectacular find. If this is an actual altar set up by Joshua, this is amazing. Of course, where is the geographical location? It's in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, and guess what? Now all the geopolitics we were talking about earlier comes into play.
Absolutely. What happens when they decide, whoever they may be, that none of this is real, that it's a great story? Does that destroy religion?
No, it doesn't. Now, I think it's relevant whether or not it's real. But
me too.
I know minimalist scholars who absolutely have no problem with it. I could name one, but I better not. He's an Israeli, in fact, who thinks that these are entire contrivances.
All of them.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But he says it doesn't affect my faith at all. When I go to a Passover Seder, it still is very meaningful. These are rich and beautiful stories. It's part of our tradition, and he's happy with that. Well, fine, but we can sit around an archaeological discussion group and really haggle out what's at stake here. And there is a lot at stake. There is really a lot that touches not only faith, but, as I keep mentioning, the modern state of Israel and its very existence, its very survival. If Israel today as a state is to survive, then it needs to be based on something more than just clever contrivances and stories, or why are we here anyway? It means a lot to modern Israelis. I can tell you that the biblical archaeology program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem today is exploding with students and with applicants, in spite of the fact that it's maybe the most grueling archaeological program on the planet. I mean, you'll be very lucky to get through in a decade. But that's what it's like when you've got another discovery. We've got now possibly the discovery of King David's palace in the old city of Jerusalem. I was just there.
That's
last
incredible.
summer, surveying this ongoing dig now. David even was dismissed as being ahistorical, as being as historical as King Arthur, if he existed at all. And that was what was predominating for the last few decades. And now, whoops,
has
we got his palace.
The entire palace, was it just covered? Was it, when you said the dig, I mean,
yeah.
How far underground was it?
Well,
covered up.
Yeah, anywhere from 10, 20 feet of rubble has accumulated on all of this stuff
over the years.
Over the years,
Jerusalem
is one huge archaeological dig, and
they built on top of things, didn't they?
Oh, well, sure. And a lot of it, though, again, is in the Arab side. In this case, of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. So in order to dig there, now there is politics involved again, and the Palestinian Authority is not too pleased with this sort of archaeology. But it's a powder keg over there, and the archaeology and the politics, everything combines in uncanny ways. But hugely important. Again, if Israel is to survive as a nation, they have to believe that they just didn't drift through space and suddenly land in where they did. That there's some sort of divine hand and providence, if you will. And here are our texts to prove it, and now here's our archaeology.
Does anybody, though, Ken, ever try to decide, let's assume this is all real. There's a God and everything else, all right? Just for a moment, we'll assume it's real. I believe it's real, but let's assume it's real.
Yeah.
Do they ever question how? How is there a God? How it started? Did the texts ever allude to that? Other than Genesis, that always said, things were made in 7 days. He always was.
Mm-hmm. It's the one presupposition I can say in the Hebrew Bible, anyhow. That is the one thing that is just taken as a given. Everything is debated. Everything is wrestled with especially angels, for example.
Yeah, but the existence is a given. Huh?
Of God is taken as a given, and it definitely sets the Israelites apart from any other people. Certainly in the ancient world, they were the only monotheistic faith. And they described, I'll say this additionally, they described God not in terms of what God is, but in terms of what God is not.
Jim, welcome to the program. Looking forward to this tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to being on here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh, thank you. Now, you're not an archaeologist, but with your background, you've really been able to do some amazing things, haven't you?
Yeah, it's incredible that that a guy with my background would be able to decipher something like this. And really, I didn't decipher it. I just I put the pieces to the puzzle together. Excuse me, and that's how I came up with a. It's just a conglomeration of information, but I put it in exact order. Every single word was deciphered. I took a translation and used it to come up with the exact details that I needed, and Georgia came out amazing.
What got you interested in this whole field?
Honestly, I'm a big Bible nut. I love to study the Bible. I'm very pro-Israel. And what I did is I was online, and I was going through Israel. It was the Israel National Radio, and they had a Bible study program on there. It was primarily from a Jewish perspective. There was a little lady on there by the name of Miriam Ben Yaakov, sweet lady. Mm-hmm. And she was teaching the class. Well, she saw my name. You had to sign in, put your name on it. You had to, kind of give them an idea of where you're from. I put Jim, Apache, okay. And she noticed it, and she said, Jim, where are you from? She sent me a text, and I told her, well, I'm from Apache, Oklahoma. She said, you're kidding me. Now, you got to understand, this is going through Israel. This class going through Israel.
Right.
Through Israel National Radio. And she told me, she said, oh, my gosh. She said, I'm in Apache, Elgin, Oklahoma. Well, Elgin, Oklahoma is like 7 miles from where I live. But at the end of the day, what happened was she was exactly 2 miles away from me. And here she is teaching a class out of Israel. And what she did was she introduced me. She was an old buddy to Vendel Jones's wife, Anita. She worked for Vendel for several years, and she was able to get a meeting with me and Vendel. I wanted to talk to him about the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's, of course, he's a scholar. He was a scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's gone now. He's passed away a few years ago. So Vendel invited me down. We sat and had a wonderful time with him and his wife, and he began to tell me about the Copper Scroll. Well, that was the least interesting of all the Dead Sea Scrolls to me. It was just a laundry list of, go here, look here, find this, and repeated that way all the way through the Copper Scroll. I had no interest in it. And he said, well, what are you interested in? I said, I love the prophecy. I love the information, biblical information that I can glean from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's a lot of information in there about biblical things. Well, I said, okay, tell me what do you know about the Copper Scroll that I don't understand? He said, Jimmy, it's got more prophecy in that one scroll than all the rest of them put together. And I listened to him.
That got your ears perked up.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it really got me perked up. And as he went through it, and he was explaining the things that he knew about it, now he and I differed completely. Whenever I finally did my evaluation of that scroll, we differed greatly on where the items were located. But I agreed with him that the Copper Scroll, I believe, was created at the time of Jeremiah.
Which would have been when, Jim?
BC-wise?
Yeah.
Well, the common thought about that is in 586 BC, about the time of the destruction of the temple. I disagree, and we'll talk about that later. But for right now, let's just say that 586 BC, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
That scroll, he began to explain that it listed items from the temple. And when he said that, I said, okay, show me. And he showed me on the scroll, and it's called the ephod. That's the breastplate that the high priest wore on the Day of Atonement whenever he went into the Holy of Holies. And I thought, oh my gosh, if that thing is there, what else could be there? Well, as I studied it, and I'm going to jump forward into the future quite a bit, I didn't start studying the Copper Scroll. I met him in June of 2006, and then we went, I began to study it on my own in December of 2006. And I found out that there was even more to it than that. There's a possibility that there's going to be some amazing biblical artifacts that are listed on this scroll that could possibly be found if in fact my research is correct.
Now, this scroll, the Copper Scroll, is it just one as opposed to the Dead Sea Scrolls?
It is one scroll, but what happened is the scroll snapped in two, because whenever you take a complete, because a Copper Scroll is literally made out of copper. Well, when they laid it out, it stretched out, or whenever the men made this thing, they hammered this sheet of copper, 3 sheets of copper, into sections of about approximately, a little over 2 feet apiece. And what they did was they pressed or they tapped the letters into this scroll, and they had to do it backwards because they wanted the scroll to be read from the reverse side, where each Hebrew letter, would protrude from the surface of the Copper Scroll. Well, when they did that, it makes the metal more brittle. It's like folding a piece of paper, several times. Once you put the folds in it, it becomes more rigid. Well, when they tried to unroll the scroll, it snapped. Now, whether that happened during the, and I do believe that it happened during the time that the scroll was actually made, they riveted each of those 3 sheets of metal. They riveted them together so that they would form one long scroll about 7 feet long and approximately a foot wide.
Now, who found these scrolls? This scroll?
The scroll was actually found by a gentleman during a excavation in 1952. And one of the interesting things about it, it was found on 20 March 1952. So the 20th of March was the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox is whenever the men at Qumran, they go in on a solar calendar. You had a gentleman on your show several months ago, I think in January. His name is Ken Hansen.
Yes.
Wonderful guy.
He knows Jewish history like nobody else. I mean, amazing.
He is a true scholar and a great guy, too. He and I are friends. The 20th of March is the beginning of the year for the guys at Qumran. Well, this gentleman by the name of Henry de Contenson, he was the one that found it. They went into Cave 3 at Qumran, in the Qumran area. There's multiple caves there. As a matter of fact, they just found one here recently, another cave that had the scrolls in it. Well, when Henry went into this thing, Mr. Contenson went into this cave, a large portion of the ceiling had dropped down and actually almost formed another wall, and they almost didn't find the scroll because they had to go behind this slab of rock and go back in there, and they saw that this scroll was sitting up on a shelf. And that's how this whole thing began, like I said, in March of 1952 in Cave 3. It's called, they give each one of them a catalog number. The Dead Sea Scroll is 3Q15, and it is just an incredible document.
Jim, who deciphered it?
Who deciphered it?
Yeah.
Well, there's been you can ask a dozen people that have tried to translate it, and you get a
dozen answers.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, here's the difference about what I did. I don't speak fluent Hebrew. I can't read fluently. However, I was an investigator. And what investigators do, you don't know the story until after you begin the investigation, and you have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Well, rather than take information that I've learned over the years through college courses, university courses, linguistic courses about Hebrew. I just simply would take the Hebrew word, and it was in ancient Hebrew, which is a little different from the Hebrew today. But I recognized all the letters because I'd been studying the Dead Sea Scrolls for years. So I took each word. I found it. Now listen to this. I found it in a biblical concordance, a Strong's concordance. I wrote down the catalog number, and I wrote down the meaning for each and every word within the scroll. Now, there are multiple words in there that were repetitive: gold, silver, and under, and cubits. All the words that were repetitive, I just went in and plugged them in as I went. For example, everywhere that it said silver, I put the word silver above that word in my research. Then I just went back in and filled in the blanks. But what you do when you do that, you're not trying to understand anything until after it forms a complete sentence. Well, the key to this is this. There's a lady that's written a book about the Copper Scroll Project. Her name is Shelley Neese.
Right. And it's a lot about you, too, right?
Oh, it's completely about the project, Copper Scroll Project. Yeah, she went with us on the first excavation we did. She's been with us almost every trip we went to Israel, and we've been to Israel a lot in the last 11 to 12 years, like 15 times, I believe. But what Shelley says is this. She says that the first line, she calls it like it's a prologue to the entire scroll. And what she's saying by that is the first line of the Copper Scroll says, "Under the ruins in the valley of Achor." Whenever I read that, or preamble, I'm sorry, when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, why are these guys looking for, and every one of the other researchers that did research on this began to look, they thought that the gold and the silver and the gems were scattered all over Israel. Well, it doesn't make any sense. They didn't have U-Haul trucks back then. They had guys with strong backs and donkey carts. So I thought, what if this preamble was talking about a specific location in the Valley of Achor? So what I did was I started off with the one location that I was very familiar with, which was Qumran. Mm-hmm. And I began to look for the first location. The first location, George says this, that there are steps heading east that are 40 cubits long. Well, whenever I saw that, I thought, wait a minute. And I oriented the map, and I just happened to have a map of Qumran laying at my desk early one morning. It was winter in December, right in the middle of Hanukkah, too. You know what Hanukkah is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. Well, for those that don't, it's a celebration of the restoration of the temple. And I looked at that, and I thought, okay, I got this thing oriented north, south, east, and west because I was a helicopter pilot in the Army. And I looked for a set of steps heading east, and I found one. There was only one set of steps heading east. So I broke out the scale, I measured it, and I'll be darned if it wasn't exactly 40 cubits long. Cubit is a measurement is about 19.2 inches approximately. Anyway, when I measured it, it was exactly 40 cubits long. Now, George, that could have been a coincidence. And it very easily could have been a coincidence. So I went to the next location. Well, the next location was also very easy to find. It was only a short distance away from there. And let me just tell you this, every one of the locations of the Copper Scroll are located in one area, probably the size of a football field, all of them except one. And I'll tell you about that one as we get a little further along in here.
Now, with these scrolls, and they talk about prophecy, how dramatic are they from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jim?
Very well. The the Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot of prophetic things in there. Just the regular standard biblical prophecies. However, George, there are other prophecies in there that people don't even recognize.
Give us an example.
Okay. For example.
We're hearing things we've probably never heard before.
Oh, I'm sure you will. And there's things about this copper scroll that you're going to hear that are just unbelievable. And here's let me tell you this up front. I wouldn't be so sure of myself had I not gone to Israel, took my research with me, set it down in front of the first guy I set it down in front of was a senior rabbi in Israel. The guy can speak Hebrew. And whenever I sat down with him, with my buddy Chris Knight, who's number 2 on the project, the rabbi looked at me and he said, "What do you guys want?" And you got to picture this. He's in his black suit. He's got his long peyote. Those are curls on the side of his head. He's got his black hat on. And
was he Hasidic?
Yeah, he was a Hasidic Jew.
Okay.
And ultra-Orthodox. And he looks at me, and he turns around and he takes his jacket off. When he took his jacket off, he had a pistol in his back in his pants.
Whoa.
And what he was doing, he's saying, "Guys, if you're crazies, you don't want to mess with me." And I respected that because I'm sure that because of his position, and I'm not going to name him right now, because of his position, he was in a dangerous location. But back to my story, he sits down with me. He says, "What exactly can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, I got something I want to do for you." I said, "Have you ever heard of the Copper Scroll?" He said, "Of course I've heard of it." I said, "Well, I think I understand how to decipher and locate the hoards of treasure that are buried on there."
And at this point, nobody has deciphered it?
No.
Okay.
No, Vendel came up with an idea, and it's interesting, but it's like a mile and a half away from what I'm talking about.
And where is the Copper Scroll now, Jim?
It's in Jordan.
Okay. It's protected?
Yeah, well, kind of. They've got a little plexiglass screen. Last time I saw any of the pictures of the location in Jordan, it was a very simple plexiglass case that they had.
Interesting. And where are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, it depends. The majority of them are right now that they have available are in Jerusalem at the. There's a museum in downtown Jerusalem. It's a very well protected, literally underground to protect these scrolls. They know how critically important those things are
to the world.
Yeah, they're so precious that there's no way to explain it. And there's going to come a day that every one of us are going to realize just how important these scrolls are to us because, listen, I call him Yeshua. Most Christians call him Jesus. He was associated with this group. John the Baptist undoubtedly associated with this group.
Were these the Essenes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't call themselves the Essenes. That's a name that came along for them later. They actually called themselves the Yahad. Now, see if you recognize any of these names. They called themselves the Sons of Light.
Nope.
They called themselves the Way.
I've heard of that.
Yep, both of those are New Testament names.
I'm the Way. All right.
Yeah, I am the Way. But also, Paul, he had joined this sect at Qumran. He even said so. He said, he denied all the charges that were against him. He was in front of King Agrippa.
And Jim, you're going to tell us some of the prophecy that was included on the scroll. Let's go right back to that and see how you all got to that point.
To the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are 3 prophecies. One is the Damascus document. It talks about 2 messiahs, the Messiah of Israel and the priestly Messiah. Yeshua, Jesus, would have been the Israeli, the prophet or the Messiah of Israel, and then John, the priestly Messiah, because he was from a priestly course. His father was even performing priestly duties within the temple whenever he found out that he was going to be having a son. Well, the Damascus document gives you an exact number of years, 390 plus 20, from the destruction of the temple to the birth of these two men, that they would come forth. And then the Melchizedek scroll gives the number of years is 40 jubilees, which do that approximately 40 years. So there's an exact number. 40 years, 50 years, 49 years between each one of the jubilees. Mm-hmm. And you come to 10 jubilees, it's the exact date of the death of Jesus. I'll just call him Jesus. And the Damascus document, another one, is from the teacher of righteousness until the destruction of the temple. It was, or the destruction of the men of lies is what it says, was exactly 40 years. And all of those are exact datings of the destruction. Like for the destruction of the temple, from the year that Yeshua died, Jesus died, 40 years later, there was the destruction of King Herod's temple. The same with, that even applies with Jeremiah. From the year that Jeremiah began his prophecies as a young man, 40 years later, the temple was destroyed. First temple was destroyed. But the Damascus document, the 390, again from the destruction of the temple, 390 plus 20, which is 410, was the birth of Yeshua and John the Baptist. Okay. So there's three prophecies right there that, people don't even talk about it. I don't get it. I don't understand why they don't do this. I do chronology research, and I've got a timeline on a Excel document that's precise. It's got all the way from Adam to 40 years in the future from now. And it's amazing. Once you use I only use biblical dating from Adam all the way down to the destruction of the Herod's temple. And all the prophecies it's amazingly exact. But you can't use secular dating. You have to use biblical dating, or they will not work.
Does anything talk about the apocalypse?
What they talk about is this: not the apocalypse. There are Dead Sea Scrolls that do talk about it, but the ones that were focusing on for the Dead Sea Scroll, there are several documents that talk about the Copper Scroll, and they talk about each one of them talks about the time whenever we discover these implements. This gold, silver, gems, and temple vessels is what they are. Each one of those scrolls tells you that whenever these things are found, it'll be the time of the restoration of Israel, the time of the coming of the Messiah, and the time of the end of the age. And those Emek HaMelech, which means Valley of the King, that's one of the documents, supporting documents. There is the Apocalypse of Baruch tells the same thing, that when these things are found, the Copper Scroll items, when they're found, it's a time of the end of the age. And then the last one is Maccabees, Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees gives a description almost exactly like the very last description on the Copper Scroll.
Where do you think the treasures might be? And what do you think it consists of?
Oh, I know what it consists of. They give you a very detailed description of what these items are, the Copper Scroll does. And the location of all these things, and guys, don't grab a shovel and head for Israel. You're going to go to jail. They protect these locations very closely.
You think they've already found things?
Yeah, well, let me tell you this. In 2009, April of 2009, well, let me back up a little further than that. I went to show my research to the head of the Antiquities Authority, Shuka Dorfman.
In Israel?
In Israel. Me and my buddy Chris and I went to Israel. A lady from, a Comanche lady from Lawton, Oklahoma knew him. And she called him for me, and she said, Shuka, I have got a young man here that needs to show you his research. He was a gentleman. He and his wife, Talma, met us at our hotel. We went to the Citadel Hotel in downtown Jerusalem. Condoleezza Rice had just left. We go in there, and his son was an assistant manager. So the son takes us up to a room where we can have privacy, and opened up the windows. We were overlooking the Temple Mount.
Must have been a great sight.
Oh, it was beautiful.
Jeez. Yeah.
It was beautiful. And I sat down with Shuka, and I said, he was the head of the Antiquities Authority now. I sat down with him, and I said, he asked me what he could do for me. And I said, well, same thing I told the rabbi. I said, it's what I want to do for you. And I began to show him my research. And at first, you got to picture this. The guy is a big fella. He sat back in his chair, he folded his arms, and it was, oh, my gosh.
A little skeptical. Here's another American who thinks he knows what he's talking about.
A lot skeptical. But 5 minutes into this, I'm not joking, 5 minutes into this, for each location, he got closer and closer and closer to the table, and I showed him 4. He was on top of it by the 4th location.
What was it that you got him interested in?
Oh, the Copper Scroll, my research on the Copper Scroll.
I mean, but what was the trigger point there that really got him into it?
Easy. I showed him the 40 cubit pool. I showed him there's another location that gives a mikveh. You know what a mikveh is?
No, I do not.
It's a baptismal.
Okay.
It's a ritual baptismal. It was the identification on it is at the north edge of the community. It's got 2 entries. You have to go down and to the left to enter into this pool. Every single one of those now matched up with the Copper Scroll. I lifted fingerprints as an investigator, and you've got to have certain number of swirls. All the points have to match on the fingerprint. Well, that one alone would have convicted anybody because it had so many points on it that converged and matched up with what they were talking about on there that Mr. Dorfman, Shuka, stopped me. He said, wait a minute. He had his hand on his forehead. He said, wait a minute. He said, let me make a phone call. He reaches in his bag. He pulls out a cell phone. He calls his secretary. And you got to understand, he's a top guy in Israel for all of the antiquities. He calls his secretary and he says, can you get, and I didn't know until afterward, I listened to the recording we made, can you get Yitzhak Magen and Yuval Peleg and have them meet with me on Monday morning? This was Friday, and they were getting ready for the Sabbath there. Right. He looked at me, he said, Mr. Barfield, can you meet us on Monday morning at my office at the Rockefeller Museum? I said, of course. Well, that's what sold him. Was all of the points on this Copper Scroll, my research, and I've got a 290-page document, all of them matched up perfectly. That's what got his attention. And if you go on the website, there's pictures on there of us sitting together at this meeting with Yitzhak Magen, Yuval Peleg. Now, Yitzhak Magen is the top man over what is called the Archaeological Department of the Civil Administration. That's the West Bank and Gaza. That's his territory. So he and Yuval Peleg, which is the main archaeologist at that time, over Qumran, they showed up at Shuka Dorfman's office. We go in, and they're sitting there. I lay out my research on the table, and you can look in the picture on the. There's one of my videos on the Copper Scroll Project website that shows all of us sitting at a table. My buddy Chris Knight stepped away, and I said, Chris, I want you to get a picture of all of us in the picture with my research laid out on the table. So there will be no doubt that I was showing them my research. Got a great picture. So now they're looking at it, and the older gentleman, Yitzhak Magen, he was angry for even being there. I mean, here's this goofy guy from Oklahoma, a retired fireman, telling him how to figure out the Copper Scroll. He didn't like that.
And what was in it and where they were and everything else.
Yeah, he didn't like it. But the other guy, Yuval Peleg, which is a younger man, he looks at Shuka, and he says to him, oh, my gosh, he said, I think this guy's done it.
Did you confirm things that they may have thought was going on?
Yeah, I did with Yuval Peleg. Matter of fact, in April of the next year, 2008, April of 2008, Yuval Peleg agreed with me he wanted to do an excavation, a preliminary excavation at Qumran to test my research. Now, guys, that doesn't happen. All the people in the audience, if they know anything about archaeology, they know that just does not happen. A non-archaeologist goes to Israel and requests to do a test excavation. Well, it was all under Yuval Peleg's name. It was all under his authority. It wasn't mine. They didn't give me a permit, and Yuval Peleg didn't need a permit. He was the guy that signed the permits for the excavations at Qumran.
How much do you think the treasures are worth, Jim?
Oh, my gosh. Well, let me give you one location. Remember where I told you there's a mikveh that was at the north edge of the community?
Right. And by the way, has anything been discovered yet?
Well, I'll tell you about that in just a minute.
All right.
But here's what happened. The location has got 900 talents of solid gold. 900 talents at 75 pounds each. Do the math.
And what's gold going for now? $1,000 bucks?
Gosh, I don't know, $1,200 an ounce, I think.
An ounce or something? At 75 pounds? Wow. 75 times 16, that'll tell you how many ounces are there. That's a lot.
Well, no, there's 14 because it's troy ounces.
Oh, okay.
But what happened is, whenever they buried those things, 900 talents, that's $1 billion in one location, and there's at least 57.
Now, are you looking for it for yourself or what?
No. Listen very closely to this, everybody in the audience. I don't want any of that money. I don't care about any of that money. I want the artifacts to be returned to Israel. I want the gold, silver, and gems to be returned to Israel. They own it. It was placed there by Israelis, and they're the ones that are supposed to get it. You
want a commission, maybe?
No,
nothing.
I don't.
Gosh, Jim, you're a rarity.
No, I don't. I don't want it because that will taint everything that I've done the last 11 years. It will taint it, and if we didn't do it for the money, because if there was they call it a finder's fee. I don't want it.
Do you think that's the biggest aspect of the Copper Scroll, where the treasures are and what's there?
Absolutely. And here's the biggest deal is the reason that the other guys couldn't find it, it's simple. Look at it like this. The instructions on the Copper Scroll is like giving instructions. If you were inviting guests over for a barbecue, you tell them, go to A Street, turn left, go 50 meters, turn right, and you'll be at my driveway.
Of course, nowadays we don't even have to do that. Just give them an address and let them GPS it. Yeah.
Well, in the old days, which is exactly what this was, you had to give the instructions. Well, they gave us the instructions right up front. It's under the ruins in the Valley of Achor. That's the key. Unless you know the neighborhood, you can't find your house for the barbecue. I found the neighborhood, Qumran. If you go to Qumran, and every one of these things match up, and there's 57 locations. They match up with the features at Qumran, the buildings, and it's easy to identify them once you stick with Qumran. You can't go all over Israel like all the other guys have been doing. You got to stick with Qumran. If you do that, you find everything.
Was there anything in the Copper Scroll project that you could deem as seriously dangerous to our future or anything like that?
Yes. The whole thing could be seriously dangerous. So, a lot of people ask me, why? This is crazy. The Israelis would have already dug it up. No. One of the things that one of the gentlemen that took over for Yitzhak Magen as head of the ADCA, he looked at me and he said, Mr. Barfield, sometimes it's best, because I did a disclosure with him. And after the disclosure, he said, sometimes it's best to just leave things alone. Because one of the things that one of the prime ministers said was this. He said, the Temple Mount is like an atomic bomb. He said, but the Ark of the Covenant is like the button. In other words, when those things come out of the ground, everything better be in order. Because just think about all the people that are going to want it. I mean, whenever the Copper Scroll was found, the Jordanians owned that property. And the Egyptians are going to say, well, you know what? All that gold and silver was provided by us, so we want a portion of it.
How deep down do you think the materials might be?
Exactly. Most of them are 7 cubits. That's about 12 feet.
Are they in tunnels, or where are they?
No, they're just buried under the ground. The only one that's in is the very last location and third location. It's in their the first or the 57th location and the third location are both inside of a cave. And the cave is easy to find once you realize that Qumran is the location where all this stuff is at. But the rest of it's just buried under the ground there, and it's non-perishable stuff: gold, silver, gems, that kind of stuff, and vessels. Silver and gold vessels are buried there.
If you want to listen to our show ad-free, 24/7, access audio archives, live chat with me, and much more, you need to become a Coast Insider now.
So you're telling me your grandmother, who died a few weeks ago, came and visited you last night in your bedroom, and you're not scared?
Are extraterrestrials living among us?
I don't know if it's true or not, folks, but we're going to find out.
If you enjoy stories like these and want to learn more about the mysteries of the universe with me, become a Coast Insider now to access hundreds of our archive shows to listen anytime, anywhere. Sign up now at coasttocoastam.com/Coast Insider. That's coasttocoastam.com/Coast Insider.
Glenn Campbell, it is always a pleasure to talk with you.
It's always been fun for me, too, Ian. We've been old friends.
So, no big surprise, though, that somehow with Glenn always comes a big backstory. And I love this about you, that you are always going into areas and doing things, and you've always got something going on. But you got to have to help me right away before we even get into the story of the Kolbrin Bible on why I'm getting emails that says you've bootlegged the Kolbrin Bible, and that this is an unauthorized Kolbrin Bible or something. What's that about?
The Fraternal Order of the Knights Templar that preserved the Kolbrin Bible from the 1184 A.D., the surviving entity that was dismantled in 1995, dissolved, because there wasn't anybody willing to take on the chivalrous code of the Knights Templar.
Yes, sir.
These people in 1992 sent out versions of the Kolbrin in all 4 directions in the world in order to make sure that this book was preserved and maintained. There are people who would like to suggest that there are groups of people who own this particular edition or own the Kolbrin outright. That's not true. It's just simply a fallacy. There are there are versions of the Kolbrin in Lebanon. There are versions in the Vatican. There's still some in England. There are versions of the Kolbrin. Our particular version came to us as it was sent to a historian in India. And certainly this was not a pirated edition. What they're referring to basically is the fact that there was another version published just shortly ago, prior to our publication, comes out of New Zealand, out of the good people in New Zealand. But it's been expensive, extremely expensive to purchase here.
Okay.
And so we have attempted to search the world to find another source for the original text, which we were absolutely amazed that we found a copy of it. And granted to us, and we have published it here in America in order to fulfill the intent of this surviving Knights Templar fraternity, and that was to preserve the text for the entire world. We tend to have people who hold up the Holy Bible and say we own it, or they hold up the Nag Hammadi text and say we are the only ones who can speak about it, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Kibra Nagast, or the B Bible, or any number of different ancient texts, when in reality these things cannot be owned by individuals or groups. They were intended for the entire world.
Well, I've totally dug reading it. Let's talk about the history of it. Let's lay it out for people that didn't read about it. Let's start from the very beginning, because you believe that at least the earliest parts of this are written in what biblical scholars would call the intertestamental period.
Yes, the earliest part. The Kolbrin Bible is different in the sense that it reads like a textbook, and it was a collection of the ancient teachings of the tribal people of Great Britain. And it comes from many different sources. It comes from the era of Scota. It comes from the era of Jeremiah. It comes from the era of Joseph of Arimathea. It most certainly comes from the traditions of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. You know, the Saxons are called the sons of Jacob in their most westward migrations. And so this text comes to us like an instruction manual. And maybe I can help you a little bit to understand it by saying that when I was young, I read a book called The Drama of the Lost Disciples, not commonly available in America. It is available in tandem with the Kolbrin at the website, ancientmanuscripts.com. But in that book, Jowett, the great British historian, suggested at the time of Jesus that the great Druids, who were called Magi by the Romans in Latin, the Latin version of the Druid in their period of time was called Magi, the same fraternal order that visited the birth of Christ. These Magi wise men were teaching courses of study, and Jowett says there were as many as 60,000 students in these great schools. And I, being kind of an investigative journalist, someone who does a profiling, looking for manuscripts, you do a profile saying, here's where a manuscript should be, let's go look for it. I look for the text that was used in these great schools. It couldn't have all have been just verbal. It had to have been written down somewhere. And guess what? It was written down, and it was hidden away at the time of Edward I, or Longshanks from Braveheart fame. Remember
Sure.
the movie?
Yeah, that would be the Patrick McGowan character.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And Longshanks did a very strange thing. He invaded Wales and burnt the Glastonbury Abbey to the ground. This is historical. This is not a guess. He burnt one of the most sacred sites of Christendom in all existence. This is the place where Joseph of Arimathea was, where Jesus was rumored to have visited himself personally, where the Virgin Mary had been, where the grandmother of Jesus had visited, where Mary Magdalene and a potpourri of biblical characters beyond imagination, including many of the apostles themselves, had been. Longshanks did not go and burn this sacred ground which had been operating as like a sovereign nation for 1,000 years. He didn't burn this to the ground just to be mean. He went there to burn this to the ground looking for evidence against the Templars. The evidence contained within a document. That document was the Kolbrin.
All right. So help me with the narrative. So the Kolbrin is written in, this period right around 0 BC, give or take time on either end. It is collected in its final form by what year, do you think?
I think that the final form of the collection of this Old Testament version was intact by the time just after Joseph of Arimathea in the 2nd century.
So just at the beginning then of the 2nd century, maybe even late 1st century, you think the Kolbrin would be already established? Then what happens to it? How did the Knights Templar get involved? That's hundreds of years before the Knights Templar.
That's correct. It was hundreds of years before the Knights Templar. But these schools existed for a long period of time. Out of the schools came very famous characters like Lucius Sejanus, the son of Claudius Caesar Britannicus, and, of course, Constantine, who was born, raised, and educated in Great Britain and knew the material that was in the Kolbrin Bible. These documents survived as a curriculum, as a course of study, and these were being taught all the way up until the time of the Crusades in Great Britain. The Knights Templar took possession of these things for a very specific reason. First of all, they were the protectors of the Vatican, and they considered themselves the protectors of these manuscripts as well. and they colored the documents with their own culture and traditions.
So they redacted or they edited parts of this, or they added parts of it that reflected the Knights Templar point of view.
They certainly did, which does not diminish this firsthand journalistic account of historical events. The story of the Exodus from Egypt that comes from Scota, who was the daughter of Ramses II or his descendant, was a story of Moses. She was the caretaker of Moses. She took care of the baby Moses. She married a Hebrew. Her husband had trained his own people to be mercenaries, which helped him preserve his political entity. You could not occupy ground without being invaded in those years by one country or another. So he trained his people to be mercenaries and work for the Egyptian people as the defense against the Ethiopians to the south. But they eventually went to Great Britain. And we get the country Scotland named after Scota. Arthur C. Clarke writes about that in his research.
Really?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so Scotland comes from the name of the caretaker for Moses, the caregiver of Moses.
And her story appears where? In the Kolbrin. It is the most magnificent independent tale of the Exodus and the time of Moses in existence in our day. What a precious beyond gold.
Well, there's some very interesting stories that also parallel other things, other stories which even, non-religious people would have heard growing up, stories of creation and stories that are ones which we might consider to be apocryphal stories or stories from which we're supposed to learn, these sort of morality tales that are in the regular Bible. But this Bible itself, could we look at it, the Kolbrin as was it considered a rival Bible? I mean, was it considered an alternative Bible or a complementary collection of works at the time?
It certainly was never intended to be a rival. It was intended to be a curriculum course of study for the great schools, the learning schools of the common people, the religious or the mystical people in Great Britain. It was like a textbook, teaching them about the creation of the world.
Then why suppress it? Why was it ever suppressed?
It was suppressed because Longshanks found a portion in the narrative of the Kolbrin Bible which reflected the Templar opinion. Now remember who the Templars were. The Templars, the first 9 Templars, were all, without exception, members of the Fraternal Order of John, or John the Baptist. John the Baptist, when he grew up, he stayed his entire lifetime in Palestine. He never left. Unlike Jesus, who went after the death of his father, Joseph the Carpenter, had the advantage of having his great-uncle Joseph of Arimathea take him on merchant vessels and visited many places during his life, along the Silk Trade routes and back to the homeland of his grandmother in Great Britain, and was not located. The missing years of Jesus are missing because he wasn't there. But these were cousins. These were families. John the Baptist was the eldest, even though it was only by a short period of time. But after the death of Christ, in the Exodus of the Faithful, Joseph of Arimathea took the bones of John the Baptist back to be buried in the homeland of his mother, Elizabeth, which was Great Britain. And if you look at the histories that have been propagated on the television and in history books, they'll tell you that the Knights Templar were worshippers of the beheaded one. They even worshipped the head. In fact, beneath the big pillar at the Rosslyn Cathedral is supposedly buried this head. Or who's this head? The head is John the Baptist. It was the head. It was the reason for the instigation of the use of the Jolly Roger flag, or the beheaded one. And so the Knights Templar...
Get out! Is that true? That the reason why we have the Jolly Roger?
That's correct. All the Templar merchant vessels flew the flag of the Jolly Roger in honor of their patron, who was John the Baptist. Now, so what we have here is we have, from a perspective of the Templars, they reverenced Jesus as being a holy man, but they thought that their illustrious birthright ancestor, John the Baptist, was really the antecedent for the coming of the Messiah. That's why Longshanks went to find this particular book in the Glastonbury Abbey and to destroy it, because remember the reason why the monarchs of Europe, Philip the Fair and the Pope Clement V, which lived with Philip the Fair, they went in to destroy the Knights Templar. Remember the two reasons they used to exterminate the Templars? It was because they spit on the cross of Christ and because they had deviant sexual practices. They didn't have deviant sexual practices. These were men whose chivalrous nature often did not allow them to marry, and so they were suspect off the bat. But the first one, when they said they spit on the cross of Christ, was because they reverenced John the Baptist as a senior member of this movement over that of Christ, though they reverenced Jesus too. And so what Longshanks was trying to do was he was trying to find evidence to pick a fight between the Vatican and the Templars in order to do what? In order to exterminate the bank. The Templars were the first bank in existence in the world.
Well, the first international bank where you could, you could invest your money on one end of the road in the Crusades, and you could take your money out on the other end.
And Longshanks and the kings of France and Spain, etc., were all heavily in debt to the Templars. And by exterminating the bank, they figured they could exterminate the debt.
All right, so the Templars hold the Kolbrin. Does that mean then that the Kolbrin was continued down in the tradition of the Templars and passed to the Masons?
Exactly.
Okay. So anybody who was a 33-degree Mason, they would have already have known about the Kolbrin.
Or a degree higher than that, yes.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm not of the Masonic order, but there are members who have of the Scottish Rites, which once again is Templar, which is also John the Baptist territory. There are there's more people in the hierarchy than just 33-degree Masons.
Okay. So at some point, they might have already been told about the Kolbrin. So it might still continue on through Masonic literature, secret Masonic literature.
Exactly. And it's been kept secret and away from the monarchs of Western Europe for 830 years.
Well, the reason why I asked is I was curious whether then there was any proof that, say, Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or anybody else would have been exposed to the Kolbrin Bible.
Well, let me give you a hint. We found, I don't know if you remember the book Holy Kingdom that we discussed years ago. I think I sent you a copy. I'm not sure if I did or not. But remember Adrian Gilbert, one of your very good guests
Sure.
that's been on the air.
Like him a lot.
He wrote the book Holy Kingdom with the research of the very brilliant Alan Wilson, Mr. Bram.
Mm-hmm.
They had on the cover of their book a sword, if you remember right. That sword was from the Arthurian epic of time, that from the 6th century A.D. It was found where? It was found on the East Coast. And I didn't know this until when we were looking at the sword very closely. On the blade of that sword, written in the ancient Negev, which was the original text, the language of the Kolbrin.
So we're just talking about how, and I'm sorry we're getting to the bottom of the hour, but that you believe that our founding father, somebody like George Washington, somebody who's a Mason, could have been exposed to this, even though really, I mean, very few people on the planet knew it existed then or know that it exists now.
Yeah, we have two doors open, but let me make a comment about the last passage you read, just a very short comment. The Kolbrin also talks about, after that period of time, the coming of Adam and Eve, and that story is so beautiful and poetic. It's probably the most brilliantly written story of Adam and Eve ever written. But it is the reason why this is the only religious text or historical text that forces science and creationism to sit back down at the same table and look at each other in the eyes, because this is 850 years old, and it predates Darwin. If Darwin would have known about this, he would have felt a lot better about his divinical training.
Well, I mean, but here, I mean, that whole thing about the she-ape, I mean, how did that pop up? It almost makes me feel like somebody wrote that now because they it reflects is sort of this modern debate.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could approve? Wouldn't it be wonderful if in fact, I'm telling you, it's true that this comes from an ancient source long before Darwin.
What's the oldest living copy we have? Living copy. What's the oldest extant copy of a Kolbrin Bible? I mean, where we can verify, this not a copy of a copy of a copy, but I mean the oldest original text we can find.
Well, we're talking about being able to find evidence of it from the time of Edward I in 1184 A.D.
Okay,
and so it's at least that old. That predates Darwin. But then we open the door too about the founding fathers. We talk about this sword that Adrian Gilbert had wrote about and had on the cover of his Holy Kingdom. It shocked the devil out of me a couple of weeks ago when I realized, written in this ancient Negev language, which is called Old Hebrew by many linguists, really isn't Old Hebrew. It predates Eber, who was the father of Peleg and Joktan. Peleg being the patriarch of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joktan being the patriarch of a civilization that went and merged with it in the Orient. But here we have this sword, and on the blade of that sword is written the word Kolbrin in ancient Negev, and it's found in Pennsylvania. And we know what Philadelphia meant to the founding fathers of this country.
Right.
We know, we're just in the beginnings of this investigation. When they found the Nag Hammadi text, Professor Robinson didn't publish his text until 1977. That was over 30 years after its discovery. The same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We are in the very first year of publication of this text. There are so many avenues for investigation and research. Your audience gets a peek into history early, and that is wonderful. Anyway, this ancient Negev language...
Wait, stop for a second. So, in the earliest version, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, was it in English, or is it in Saxon, or what's the language that the earliest known version is in?
Negev.
Negev.
Okay,
and that is a dialect of what?
Negev is a Middle Eastern language, like I said, was used by Eber, the patriarch of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The ancient Negev is found in petroglyphs and on every single continent in the world. It's located in petroglyphs in Arizona. It's in California. Vindel Jones has found some in Texas. We find them, obviously, at our cave site in Illinois. This has been amazing to me. It's because when Wayne and I first went and gathered our first few hundred rune stones from the cave, they were in this weird language, and we couldn't read it. But we found James Harris, who could read ancient Negev, and suddenly he's reading to us the stories from the cave, and I'm going, oh, my gosh.
Well, somebody asked me about that, too, the other day. They said, do you have an update on the Illinois cave excavations?
Well, we do. It's still in probate, and until that gets out of probate, no one can get into it. And it's been in probate and had some problems with ownership for the last 7 years. So, but that's hopefully going to resolve itself this spring. And we have never given up. We're like tenacious dogs. We don't give up on these things. We're going to bring it to coast to coast when we finally do it. But we've had rune stones. We have hundreds of them that come out of the cave, and many of them are written in this ancient Negev language, which for the first time we can read and understand, and they have stories on it from this same Kolbrin manuscript. And the evidence is clear that these stories were once had in America.
All right, so the Negev language and these rune stones of which you speak, they would have had to have come, though, into those Illinois caves up the Mississippi again. We're thinking from the Egyptians?
No, they would have come from the flight from the Roman armies in the first century who went in and culminated in the destruction of Masada in 73 AD. It would have been prior to that.
Okay, prior to that. Okay, thank you. So now, back to Negev, and you were starting to say before I interrupted you. So this is what we have, and this is what we can read this, and it's just getting the kind of exposure that it deserves. But some of the stories, I think, are the most interesting parts of this. So I want you to address that Adam and Eve story after the next hour. But before we go any further, could you go back and talk about this idea of a space threat, of an ancient warning of a potential war of some sort?
Well, we know that the Mayans talked about a destruction of the earth that would happen again in the year 2012. I know the heirs to the Inca throne, who, by the way, live in California now. I have spoken with them at length about their destruction sequences at the end of the earth. For heaven's sake, Plato talked about the ultimate destructions of the earth and ushering in 1,000 years of peace, which he called the return of Atlantis. The Christians called it the millennial era of time. The people of Mu talked about it, the return of Eden or Eden, or the garden. In my opinion, that's where we get the terminology of the Garden of Eden. Every single culture talked about a destructive moment in time that is to come. Now, you've had brilliant guests. Marshall Masters, for example, has talked about this on your program, about the coming of this destroyer, the coming of Planet X. I'm not the one that probably should be the one being interviewed on that particular subject, because they have done such a brilliant job of doing that. But someday we're going to find out the reason why they put the most expensive observatory at the South Pole, because we cannot see what's coming to us from the Northern Hemisphere.
Well, but what is this space threat? I mean, if you could just address that, and this idea of the destroyer, of this catastrophic, massive red comet that orbits our sun.
It's not a comet. It's a spherical, planetoid-like entity.
Okay, I was just reading off the back of your book. So they say massive red comet that orbits our sun, called the Destroyer.
Yeah, but it doesn't orbit in the solar plane. In other words, all of the planets are in a kind of a plane like a disk. This particular orbiting body is in a juxtaposition with that orbit. It's coming. It only comes around every so many thousands of years, and it's predicted by the Mayans to return in 2012 again. And once again, the brilliant thing about the Kolbrin is that it gives a first-hand journalistic description of the last time it came around and what happened. What happened to the earth? What happened to the people? How many people were destroyed? What were the events that occurred on the earth? And,
because the Kolbrin goes into that the earth was essentially created and then recreated. I read that earlier in the hour. Do you want to tell that story of how that supposedly came about?
Well, once again, I think that you've already had other guests. I'm better at the history of the Exodus, etc. But yes, what happens is that this planetoid type body comes. It alters the magnetic poles. It causes the earth to wobble, earthquakes and volcanoes. It causes some very specific changes in the earth that mimic many things that look like the plagues of Egypt. If you read in the books of the Egyptians later on in the manuscript, which you probably haven't got to yet, it'll talk about the specific events that occur, which very much are like the plagues of Egypt, where the waters turn red, and that there are fish die, and that there are frogs and lice and things that feed on the bodies of those things, etc.
Yep. I'll read from Manuscripts 3 here when it says, "When blood drops upon the earth, the destroyer will appear, and mountains will open up and belch forth fire and ashes. Trees will be destroyed, and all living things engulfed. Waters will be swallowed up by the land, and the seas will boil. The heavens will burn brightly and redly. There will be a copper hue over the face of the land, followed by a day of darkness. A new moon will appear and break up and fall. The people will scatter in madness. They will hear the trumpet and the battle cry of the destroyer, and will seek refuge within dens of the earth. Terror will eat away their hearts, and their courage will flow from them like water from a broken pitcher. They will be eaten up in the flames of wrath and consumed by the breath of the destroyer. In those days, men will have the great book before them. Wisdom will be revealed. The few will be gathered for the stand. It is the hour of trial. The dauntless ones will survive. The stout-hearted will not go down in destruction.
Remember in the book of Revelation it said the moon would turn to blood?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is describing the same event. This sphere comes with it with a cloud of iron ore, or many of the comets, many of the meteors that have an iron base, and apparently there is an iron debris field, which is much like a comet that surrounds us. But the difference between a comet is it's largely ice and stone. This one appears to be largely made of a heavy metal core with a debris field of iron ore, which will come out of the sky like drops of blood from the sky. It'll turn the moon to blood again. And, the two stories are intertwined like someone wrote both texts, though they obviously were written very separately by different cultures at very different moments in time.
So then this book, it bounces around. We know that, as you said, Edward I tries to find it, destroy it, look for help him use that to help get the Knights Templar. What happens to it after that? I mean, give us more of a timeline of what happens to the Kolbrin Bible.
Well, the Templars, remember, by the time of 1307, Philip the Fair and Clement V. Clement V lived in France under the leadership or under the monarchy of Philip the Fair. They go out to destroy these Templars, who, by the way, were all original members of the Fraternal Order of John the Baptist, okay?
Right.
Now, where did they go and exit? Where did they flee to? They fled to Scotland, which is very important because what comes out of Scotland in our day? The Scottish rites of the Masonic Scottish rites. And many of the things that were taught in the ancient Kolbrin and amongst the Templars were inherited, brought over to the Americas with our founding fathers. So the Templars took this book to Scotland, and by the way, that's where it was preserved by a branch of the Templars until our day, until 1992, when there were copies disseminated around the world to various specific sources, before they took out a petition for dissolution in 1995. You notice that none of the copies of the Kolbrin are that old.
Now, why would they not want this shared earlier? I mean, it doesn't seem like this gives the Knights Templar any particular power. They didn't have to worry anymore about religious persecution. I mean, after a certain point, that even that doesn't happen in England or Scotland or anywhere else. So why not just put it out there?
Well, we're the first generation that would tolerate such a thing.
What do you mean by that? I mean, you had Nag Hammadi, you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a good time to throw open.
That's our generation, too.
Yeah, but I meat that's a good time to throw out the Kolbrin Bible.
Do you know how many movements are still in America who believe that Gnostics were evil, wicked men, that were the dross of the earth, and the Gnostics being the authors of the Nag Hammadi library itself? I mean, if the Nag Hammadi library would have been found at the time of the founding fathers, they would have killed them. They would just after the time of the Templars. Now, remember that this ushered in the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, I get why they wouldn't mention it at the times of the Spanish Inquisition. That's totally fair. But you would think, really, from 1850 forward or something like that, you could have released something like this, and nothing bad would have happened to you.
Well, you get 800 years of hiding a document under your belt.
Yeah.
You get used to hiding it, and you
Force
look for
of
a reason
habit
to bring it about.
Right, okay.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial. Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Jim Barfield back with us. Jim is the director of the Copper Scroll Project. Now, his personal interest in Bible study led him to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where he came across the least understandable scroll of all. It's called the Copper Scroll. It describes gold, silver, gems, and temple artifacts, which upon discovery will signal the coming of end times. Jim is a retired criminal investigator, multiple career positions. After his retirement in 2005, he founded the Copper Scroll Project and began traveling to Israel to confirm his research on the ancient documents and development relationships with the Israeli government and civil leaders to conduct an excavation of the ruins of Qumran to discover the 57 potential hoards of temple treasures that are buried under the national park. Jim, welcome back. How you been? It's been a while.
It has been a while. How are you, Mr. Norrie?
Everything is good. And how's the project coming along?
Well, the pandemic really put the brakes on things. We've actually been out of business for about, I guess a little over a year and a half now. We've still been doing some projects and speaking in a lot of places, but actually getting back to Israel, it's put a stop to that. The Israelis are really strict about the COVID-19 stuff, so we are getting ready to go back over, hopefully in January.
How did you get involved in this project in the first place, Jim?
It's just like you said in your introduction. It was Bible study. Sounds crazy, and it sounds incredibly far-fetched, but it really was. It was my Bible study. I got to studying, and I realized that, in 30 A.D., there were three main groups. There were the Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Essenes. But the New Testament appeared never to mention the Essenes, and since Jesus opposed the other two groups, Pharisees and Sadducees, I focused on the Essenes. And all the ancient historians, Philo, Pliny, Josephus, really spoke highly of the Essenes. So I started studying those guys. And, George, it was just incredible how much the Essenes were praised by these men. And then I started getting deeper into it, and the amazing similarities turned into really undeniable parallels in teachings, religious practices, financial observations, material ownership rules, and time requirements for the promotions within the group of the Essenes that matched the group, the disciples of the groups of John the Baptist and Jesus exactly. And that's why I got to studying into it. And the more I studied into it, I got to the books about the community rule and that sort of thing. And I realized that their names, even the names, the titles of the groups that Jesus and John the Baptist were with, the poor, the sons of light, the way, the brethren, the many, the lot of Melchizedek, which is better known as the Melchizedek order, they were all the same names that they were using in the Bible for the disciples and the men that Jesus and John the Baptist were working with. Even the book of Hebrews, there's a lot of details about the order in there that actually says that Jesus was of the lot of Melchizedek, or the order of Melchizedek order.
You've done your homework, Jimmy.
Oh gosh, it's been amazing. And you know what? I'm going to be honest with you. When I first got to Israel and I sat down with the director general for the Antiquities Authority, the guy thought I was a nut. And I understood. Here's a guy from Oklahoma going to Israel, sitting down with the head of the Antiquities Authority and his wife. They had invited me to a room not a room, but a kind of a parlor at the Citadel Hotel in downtown Jerusalem. But you know what? after about 5 minutes of talking to the guy, he just loved it. And he grabbed his phone, and I thought he was angry at first. He grabbed his phone out of his bag, and he called and set up a meeting between me and Yitzhak Magen and Yuval Peleg. Yuval Peleg was actually the archaeologist that worked at Qumran. He loved it. And he and I had some more meetings, and that's how the things really began to happen.
And when we last talked, which was about 4 years ago, has anything changed over the past 4 years in terms of information?
Yeah, there has been. There's been more information about, let me give you an example. There's in the Copper Scroll, it talks about a location called the Cliff of Judgment. In that Cliff of Judgment, or that story about the Cliff of Judgment, I began to study details around Qumran and around the surrounding cliffs. Well, there was a place called in the Talmud. It's called the Zuk. That's the place where the Israelis would stand with the priest or the man that escorted the goat, the Azazel goat, out to the cliff and would push him off of the cliff. And oh my goodness, when I got to doing the study on it, I pulled up a because I wasn't in Israel at the time. I pulled up the Google Earth, and as I zoomed in on the spot that I thought might be the place where they pushed the goat off the cliff, because when they talked about it, it said that the goat would fall so far that it would literally destroy the goat before it ever hit the ground at the other end. It tore to bits. It sounds horrible, but that's what happened. And the cliffs around Qumran, I kind of thought initially that was going to be the place where they pushed the goat off. It would kill the goat, but it wouldn't have done that much damage to it. So I went to another place that's about a mile away, and I zoomed in on it, and oh my goodness, there's a perfect spot there where they could see, they could actually see Qumran from there, and the people at Qumran could see the events taking place with the goat. Did I talk to you about a stone that's set out at the south end of the Qumran complex?
I can't recall. I don't think so.
That's what I thought. There is a stone. It's probably 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet long, and 2.5 feet tall. They talk about in the Talmud, which is like a major dictionary for Jewish information. They have debates in there and that sort of thing. And where they discuss it in what is called Yoma. It means the day, like the Day of Atonement information. And they said that they took a ribbon out to this location near Qumran where they would push it off, and I measured it. Based on the information from the Talmud, I measured it, and it was exactly the right distance. And I thought, well, maybe this is the place. So I kept studying it, kept looking at it, and I literally measured it out by the feet, because with Google Earth you can do that. You can measure the feet, miles, everything. What I found was this. That spot matched it exactly, and in the Talmud it said that they took a piece of the ribbon, tied it to the door of the temple. It's a red ribbon. And then they took another piece the day before, and they went out to a place where they observed it, and they tied it to a rock. I'm going to tell you that rock has got to be the spot, because it's a perfect place to locate yourself to see what's happening. And it's got a hole bored in it where you could set a block of wood to tie the ribbon to. And then the other piece of the ribbon, of course, went with the goat. Now, this sounds crazy, because I'm telling you, it's true. They would push the goat off, and if the goat, if God forgave the sins of Israel, then the ribbon would turn white. And that's exactly what happened. It was amazing. So anyway, I've shown my research to some Israelis, and there's a gentleman in the United States that I showed it to. He is a expert He's an expert on all the things that pertain to the temple. And he said, yeah, this, my goodness, this makes so much more sense than where they say that this actually took place at.
Jim, I'd like you to describe for folks the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then we'll get into the Copper Scroll, of course.
These scrolls were actually, the place where they found all these, it's called a Genizah. In Hebrew, it's a place for storing old documents. Well, they would store them in these Genizahs because they've got the name of God on them. And if anything that has the name of God on it, they want to make sure that it's protected because they hold the name of God in such high esteem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all these books, scrolls begin to get collected inside of these caves, which they used as Genizahs, storage places.
Were they in little clay vases?
Well, no, they're not little. They were actually pretty big. They're about 2.5 feet tall. They got a clay lid, and they're about, I'm going to say about a foot in diameter.
And there's one scroll per vase?
No, there's usually a couple of scrolls.
Couple of them.
You would be surprised how tiny, whenever they print these scrolls, I would have to use my glasses and a magnifying glass to be able to read them. They're just tiny little letters, and so they could get, because the scrolls were difficult to make. They were made out of lamb skin, goat skin, ibex skins, and they would write on them. They would line it out, they would cut it, and then they'd sew each section of the lambskin together to make a scroll.
And they rolled them up?
Yes, they did. They rolled them up just like it sounds into a scroll. Usually two-sided. They'd roll it out on one side and spin it and turn it and be able to find the locations that they wanted within the Bible.
How many scrolls were there hidden away there in the cave?
Every book of the Bible, except the New Testament, for what they call the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. All the books were found, including the books of Enoch, the book of Jubilees. The only one that wasn't found was the book of Esther. It hadn't been found in there. Maybe it will be. I don't know, but that's the only one that was not there. But it's the books about this sect, about the Essenes, their secular practices, they're the most fascinating, and those are the ones that drew me to them because they explain so much about. I absolutely believe that John the Baptist and Jesus were both associated with, very strongly associated with the Essenes at Qumran.
Who are the ones who apparently wrote the scrolls, right?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how a lot of these experts don't recognize these things with the Essenes. There's so many matching details about the Essenes, it's impossible not to recognize it. Sometimes it's almost like they don't want people to realize and see what's there. There's actually was a time that I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about a discovery at Qumran. They had found a grave that was made, and the casket was covered with mica. And they said it was obviously a very important individual. The next day, I've never heard anything about it since then. Who could that have possibly been? I don't know. Personally, I think it could have been Jeremiah or Ezekiel, any one of the prophets.
Over what period of time, Jim, do you think the scrolls were made? A couple of years, 3 years, 4 years? How long do you think it took?
To make one scroll?
To make all of them.
Oh, gosh. You're talking hundreds of years.
Really?
Because, yeah, oh, gosh, yeah, because the Essenes didn't pop up overnight. I absolutely believe that they are the group that Samuel, he had a school of prophets, and their studies were done out there, dating studies of Qumran and the buildings. And Roland DeBow actually thought that was the location where the Essenes had a college. So yeah, it was years because they would write a scroll, and then another prophet would pop up. Let's say Samuel, for example. Samuel would write his scrolls there, and of course they would copy them. And they had a scriptorium within the ruins of Qumran. It was a long building, so they could stretch the scrolls out. They had long tables that they would put the scrolls on, and they could write and recopy the scrolls. And that's why it's so hard to date them, other than if they do carbon dating.
Does it look like one person may have been responsible for a number of scrolls over a certain amount of years, and then maybe that person died and somebody else came in?
Yeah, and they base that primarily on, just like they do handwriting analysis. They look at it, and it's like with the Copper Scroll. You can see 5 different handwritings on the Copper Scroll. So, yes, I do believe that one guy would, serve his time as the
scribe.
Thank you, scribe. And then another gentleman would step up and take the job, because you had to have some skill to be able to write that tiny and make it legible. And then you have to think about, have you ever heard of I can't think of it, mezuzah. They put it on the doors. You ever heard of those things?
I have not, no.
They're a scroll from out of Deuteronomy, and they're tiny little scrolls, but they've got an entire section of Deuteronomy written on it. Well, they found one of them at Qumran, one of these scrolls that fit inside of a mezuzah. In the Bible, it says, you shall put these on the doorpost of your house, and you will read about them when you rise up, when you go to bed, that sort of thing. Well, they literally put them on their doorposts. And those tiny little scrolls, they found one of them, and they had to have taken a hair, dipped it in the ink, and wrote the scroll. That's how tiny they were.
That's amazing.
These guys were skilled.
Do you think the scrolls were dictated, Jim, or simply written out?
I think they were dictated initially. I'm sure they were. Because, for example, Jeremiah had his own, he had his own scribe.
Who came along with him.
Yeah, they had their own scribe. His Jeremiah's was Baruch. They would all, he would sit down with him, and they'd write these scrolls out. And Baruch even had some of his own writings are in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So basically the scrolls are the Bible.
Yeah, and I'm telling you, Qumran, I don't know if I told you the last time I talked to you, but Qumran, I was doing a study, and I was trying to determine some information about Qumran. So I was looking for a map of Jerusalem at the time of Jeremiah. Did I tell you about this?
No.
Well, I found a map of Jerusalem, only I didn't recognize it. Of course, it was written at the time of Jeremiah. And matter of fact, when I saw it, I thought it was a map of Jerusalem, of Qumran, upside down. And I thought, my goodness, why would this guy, whoever this was on the website, why would he put a map of Qumran on there, for one thing? And then why would he put it upside down? Well, it wasn't Qumran.
It wasn't that.
Yeah, what happened
was it accurate, though?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, it was accurate. It was accurate, as good as guys at that time could make it.
Jim, the book of Revelations was written by someone called John. They believe it was Apostle John. They're not sure, but was that included in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well? I think it was.
No, I don't believe they found any New Testament books in there. But know this, there are books that are that have been taken out of the Dead Sea Scroll collection because there's been a lot of Bedouins and, treasure hunters and that have gone in there and stolen books out of there. And I'm sure that there's books that are missing from the collection. And if anybody wanted to hide something, that would probably be one of the ones they wanted to hide, because that's a pretty big money-making location.
Yeah.
Qumran is a big tourist place. So they would not want to ruin their income from that. But is there a possibility? I believe yes, there is a very good possibility.
Tell us about the Copper Scroll Project.
Oh, that's been an absolute blessing. I got involved with it. I ran into a guy by the name of Bendel Jones.
We knew him.
Did you?
He was like the modern day Indiana Jones.
That's what he believed. He was a character. I spent a couple of weekends with him.
He passed away, didn't he?
He did a few years ago, about the time I saw and talked to you last.
Yes, exactly.
He passed away. He was a good guy. Our research was very different. All of the items from the Copper Scroll, I've identified all but one of 57 locations. All but one, I can't find it at Qumran. I don't know exactly where it's in the ruins somewhere, but I just can't tell you where. But the Copper Scroll, it's literally a metal document made of copper to last at least a couple thousand years, and they wanted that document to be able to point whoever discovered, whoever understood, learned to understand it, to be able to find all these locations. And in particular, there's a cave about 340, 380 yards from Qumran to the northwest. They wanted that spot in particular to be found because it's got the mother lode of, if you ever seen the movie National Treasure.
Oh, yeah, with Nicolas Cage.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Well, you want to talk about some amazing treasures. That's what very well could be inside of that cave. There's documents in Angelic, which means belly of the king, Second Maccabees, and one other one. It's a marble tablet, the Ezekiel tablets. There's the last two tell the same story as the Angelic, the belly of the king scroll, but they tell about the Copper Scroll. They call it a copper document, and they tell about just incredible amounts of gold and silver that are hidden inside of a cave. And they describe the cave. The Copper Scroll describes the location that we found to a T. And it's here's the Indiana Jones part of it. Locations 1, 2, and 3, with 3 being the cave, are in a straight line. Locations 53 through 57, with 57 being the cave, are in a straight line. And they come to a V right over the spot that we've selected or determined to be the location for the cave. Now, if I'm right about that one, the possibility of some of the most amazing religious artifacts and scrolls, that's what I'm interested in. There's going to be massive amounts of scrolls in there. And if you think the Dead Sea Scroll collection is going to be amazing, the collection of scrolls that they'll have inside of that cave, because they are planning, that's what the whole thing was set up for, a rabbi told me in Israel, he said, Jim, he said, when you get these things out of the ground, do you realize what it is? And I said, well, yeah, they're treasures. He said, no. This is the dowry for the coming bride of the Messiah. And I thought, oh, my gosh, that makes so much sense, because everything that they need to set things back in motion, to include the tabernacle of Moses, will be inside of that cave, if I'm right.
Has anybody explored the cave yet?
No. Here's the thing. On the Copper Scroll and in the story about Second Maccabees, what they did is Jeremiah and his teams put all this gold, silver, the artifacts from the Temple of Solomon, not Herod, King Solomon. They put all these artifacts inside of a cave. Then they took plaster and mortar, because those guys were masons. They smeared this stuff on there and covered and sealed that wall shut. Because if you're going to put something inside of a cave, Qumran's the place to do it. That is one of the, if not the driest place on earth, it is one of the driest places.
Might they be King Solomon's treasure?
Absolutely. The items that are buried inside of that cave are King Solomon's treasure. There's no doubt about it, if I'm right. And those things still exist in there. But here's what I know. There was a deputy speaker of the Knesset His name is Moshe Feiglin. He was angry that the Israelis, the government, didn't do any more research on what I had found, because he's seen my research, and he absolutely believes I'm correct. He went out there with me, and we scanned it with a very powerful metal detector, and we scanned that cave. And, George, there is just, it's like in stacks. We scanned a small area, but there were like 5 stacks of non-ferrous metals in one row, and another 5 to 6 stacks in another row. So that was just incredible, and we have a good, strong evidence that these items are still there.
Now, we were talking about the cave, which is protected by Israel. Is the cave in the West Bank as well?
Yeah, it is. The cave, all of it, Qumran, everything's in the West Bank. This portion of it, of the West Bank, is controlled by the Israelis. And because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now possibly because of what I've discovered there, they're going to make sure that they hang on to that area. Matter of fact, when Trump did his, he was trying to get the Jordan Valley. That was it. That included, and it went right down and made sure to include Qumran, and probably because they know that it's so important for the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it was included in that as well.
It's remarkable. In terms of the Copper Scroll Project, how did you find out about it?
About the Copper Scroll?
Yeah.
I'd gone to see Vendel. I had some other research that I was doing on the chronology, biblical chronology from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I was invited to his home and sat down with him, and he was telling me about the Copper Scroll.
So he knew about it?
Oh, Vendel, yeah. He was the Copper Scroll guy of the day. Again, I didn't agree with his research, but his information on the Copper Scroll, about Jeremiah, about the prophets, about how many writers, I got to give him credit for that. The research of all the information or the items being in Qumran, that was my research. But yeah, Vendel's the one that got me interested, because I wasn't interested in the Copper Scroll at all, because it was just a kosher list of gold and silver, and it really didn't interest me until I realized, oh my gosh, these are prophets. All this stuff that's in there is for the coming of the Messiah.
Did they have a date about that coming of the Messiah?
Did they have a date? What they say is when these things are found, when the items of the Copper Scroll are found, it would be the time of the coming of the Messiah and the time of the restoration of the tribes of Israel. So as far as a date, that's as close as you're going to get, other than this. Every Sabbath, every seventh day, the Jewish people celebrate Sabbath. Well, they do that in remembrance of, to remind them of, that for one thing, the Sabbath is a wedding ring to a Jewish person. That's their sign that they're related. They're related to God, intensely related to God. But that Sabbath also represents the 1,000-year millennial reign of the Messiah. And George, we are at the end of the sixth day, and based on the chronology research, everybody knows it. We are at the end of the sixth day, and if I'm right about the Copper Scroll items, that's what's happened. Is I've identified where these locations are at, and now if we start pulling them out of the ground, look up, because the time has come.
Sooner than later, Jim, isn't it?
I think so. I absolutely believe it's going to be sooner than later. And that's why I'm so eager to get back over to Israel.
Was the Copper Scroll tossed in with the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is that separate?
Yeah, it was with the Dead Sea Scrolls. K3 is about where they found the Copper Scroll. It's about a mile from Qumran to the north. And what the prophets did with it is they took it in there, they rolled it up after they got it all written and riveted together. They rolled it up, it snapped in two, and then they had two rolls instead of just one. But they hid them on a shelf a dirt shelf inside of Cave 3, and they left them there. Well, nature pulled a little trick on them. The ceiling collapsed, probably during one of the earthquakes. It collapsed and formed a false wall between the entrance and the copper scroll. Well, luckily they found it on the last day of an excavation they were doing. They found it, and they pulled it out and realized what they had found was a treasure map.
Do the Dead Sea Scrolls say anything that scares you?
That scares me? No. There is nothing that scares me. There's what we call a term of endearment. What it says is there are seven groupings of Greek letters, and those seven groupings give you actually spell out a sentence. It says, in the wilderness, the hand of the priest will give drink to the spirit of grace in the sixth age. Well, the sixth age is coming to an end. And that term is the same ones that are in Isaiah and Jeremiah. They talk about the priest giving a drink in the wilderness. And what they're saying is it's the time of the wedding. It's the time of restoring of Israel. Even there's a scroll called the Melchizedek scroll. And it gives the date of the crucifixion of Jesus. It gives the exact year. It gives the exact biblical holiday, which is a year of Jubilee. And it was all done on the Day of Atonement. At the same time they were doing the goat thing. That's what was happening there. And as a matter of fact, whenever Jesus got up to read in the synagogue and they tried to throw him off a cliff, that was the exact same year that scroll's talking about, with the coming of the Messiah or the priest, and it was a Melchizedek priest. So, yeah, there's a term of endearment but it's something to give us hope.
Jim, where are the scrolls now? Are they in Jordan?
No, the copper scroll is. They got it in a special case in the Amman, Jordan Museum. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the majority of them now are in Israel at the Shrine of the Book.
Are you going to go back when they go into the cave?
Are you kidding? You betcha I'm going to go.
They can't keep you away, huh?
Oh, no. You know what I put in? It's been 14 years, 15 years now that I've been working on this. I've been to Israel 17 times, and I'm vested in this. I don't care about the money, about the gold and silver. I told my buddies, the guys that have been with me this whole time, we got a spot right outside that cave, and there's a little mound. We're going to sit on that mound and watch the priests bring all those items out of there, and that's going to be our reward for this.
What do you think it's worth? Just guess.
Well, let me give you one location. One location has 900 talents of pure gold. 900 talents. A talent is 75 pounds. That is almost $2 billion worth of gold in one location.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's silver. There's one location, we identified it with these metal detector we used. It's about 60 feet long, and it's got just, it looks like, the way I understand it, they're like ingots, round ingots that were stacked in there. And it's, 6 feet long, probably about 4 feet wide, the best I can guess. So who knows how much silver's there? They set it up. Some of the, I think there's a message, and it sounds silly, but I think there's a message in how many ingots they would put in each of the locations. For example, there's 40 ingots at the double entry mikvah. There's 390 ingots, or not ingots, but talents of golden vessels, torn and ripped to pieces. Those were, I absolutely believe, those are the ones that Nebuchadnezzar cut to pieces in the story of, I believe it's 2 Kings. Tells about some golden items being chopped up. and the government of Babylon actually gave them to Jeremiah as a gift, because Jeremiah was telling all the Israelis, don't pass go, grab your stuff and get to Babylon. You're going to go into exile for 70 years. He had been warning about this, and he told them, just go. You're going to die if you fight. Just go. So I think there's a story or a message in how many ingots are out there. And George Eyre is just incredible literally tons of gold and silver out there.
Why did the Qumran prophets bury the treasures? Why were they trying to hide them?
Well, the Babylonians had, in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's men attacked Qumran. And that's why they hid all the stuff
including the scrolls.
Yeah, they hid everything. They left everything. The scrolls were already there because they were already retired scrolls inside of the caves. But they put all the gold and silver in the ground after that, because there's a big building there. It's a really big building. The walls are like 20 feet thick, and it's really deep chambers in it, and it's hard to get in because it's got one small door. But I bet it was packed full of gold and silver at the time of the attack, and they fought. And the priests, the men at Qumran won the battle. But they lost a lot of men, and they had enough men to bury the treasures after that. But that's what happened with it, and why they buried it is they didn't want to take it any further than they had to. They just buried it right there within the ruins, and apparently it worked. Nobody's found them until now.
Why do you think it's taken so long to uncover them?
Are you asking why the Israelis haven't done anything about it?
Yeah.
Netanyahu said one time, I hope I quote him right, he said the Temple Mount is like an atomic bomb, but the Ark of the Covenant is like a button. In other words, they are afraid of these things. I sat down with the guy that was Director General, Hanania Hizmi, of all of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I gave him a presentation of my research. And at first the guy was just like everybody else. They thought I was a nut until he saw the research. Then he was trying to keep a poker face, but the guy better never go to Las Vegas because he'll lose his butt. He was just excited about it. But then whenever I got done, he said, Mr. Barfield, sometimes it's best just to leave things alone. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it's just best to leave things alone. And then a guy by the name of Orrin Gutfield was going to work with me as an archaeologist. He said, no problem. He said, I can get a permit. We can go out there. We can do whatever. He was wrong, because Hanania Hizmi closed Qumran to excavation within the ruins. He closed it the next day after he talked to me.
Wow. Now, of course, you don't speak or read Hebrew, but you've been able to decipher. So how did you do this?
It was honestly very simple. What I did is I've been studying the Dead Sea Scrolls since 1995, I believe. And I knew all the ancient Hebrew script. I knew it very well. And then whenever I got a copy of the Copper Scroll, what I did is I just would find a word, go to the concordance, the Strong's Concordance, and look up the word in the concordance, find the meaning, and I'd plug it in. Then I'd go to the next word, and the next word, and the next word. And it worked incredibly well. The guys that have seen my research, especially the archaeologists and the rabbis just loved it. I met with the Sanhedrin, and they were beside themselves. But that's how I did it. I just simply took the concordance and used it and filled in the blanks. And listen to this. The Copper Scroll, you can definitely see the handwriting styles for those guys. There's 5 men that wrote it, and 2 of those guys were definitely people you know from the Bible. It was Haggai and Zechariah. So when you look at the writing from the Copper Scroll, oh my goodness, you're looking at the handwriting of those two men. They were boys at the time they wrote it, but they were, of course, they grew up and came back to Qumran, and they were older men by the time they got back. They were probably in their 80s by the time they got back. But yes, those kind of things do happen.
When they deciphered the Dead Sea Scrolls, how long did it take them, Jim?
It took a long time, mainly because there was a lot of, in the archaeological world, in the history world over there, it's a cat and mouse game over there. Those guys are vicious. They're very protective of their territory. The guys that were translating the scrolls took forever. It wasn't from 1947 when they found the scrolls until they actually let them loose for examination was 1991, and they still didn't have them all translated. It's just a quagmire of academic jealousy, and because everybody wants to have their name on this stuff, and so that's why it's taken so darn long.
I'd like to know who the person is who dictated the stories to them. That's the story. What do you think? The scrolls of the prophets, you can tell who did that. Jeremiah dictated to Baruch, and Isaiah dictated to his scribe, and so on. So they are the ones that told the prophetic stories. Now, the kings, they had scribes in the temple and that worked for the king that wrote down and jotted down all that information. It's kind of like with our presidents. They've got presidential libraries. They got all that stuff recorded. So there were men that were trained and set up to do that kind of thing. Where do you think the Ark of the Covenant might be?
I really believe it's in the cave that we've been talking about, because Second Maccabees and Melech and the other books that I've named, they all say that it's in a buried cave, described just like I've been telling you. So the probability that it's in the cave, I think, is very high. But let me tell you this: I don't care who finds it, just so long as it's found. Whoever, there was another gentleman, Ron Wyatt. He said he found underneath a Temple Mount. If he's right, then that's wonderful. I think that'd be fantastic.
He's the one who thinks he found Noah's Ark as well, isn't he?
Yes, a couple of things he's done, like the Noah's Ark thing and the Red Sea crossing. Very, very interesting information that he's got on there.
The little shepherd boy, the Essene, who found the Dead Sea Scrolls, what was he doing in the cave? Just wandering around?
No, he was chasing a goat. He was a little shepherd boy. He wasn't an Essene. He was a little shepherd boy of Bedouin, I believe. And he was throwing rocks and threw a rock down inside of the cave 4, I believe. And he hit one of the jars and broke it. And he thought, wow, what in the world is in there? And, of course, they're always looking for antiquities because they can make money off of them. So he went into the cave, and that's how he wound up with the first few scrolls.
How many years do you think the scrolls were in the cave before they were discovered in 1946-47?
Oh, I can almost tell you to the year. It's from 70 A.D. Until 1947.
Wow.
So
a long time.
It's a long time they were in there.
That is amazing. That nobody else would go in. How far into the cave were they, Jim?
The way that Cave 4 is, you almost have to go in from the top. It's like a plateau right next to the plateau that Qumran building sit on.
You got to lower yourself into a hole or something?
Yep, you do. You got to lower yourself into a hole, and that's where a lot of them went. Now, the other scrolls, the other caves are just like regular caves. Like Cave 3 where the Copper Scroll was found. You can walk right into it, and there's a pretty big space in there.
Jim, I want you to give out your website, would you, sir?
Yeah, just the Copper Scroll Project, all one word, .com. And that's how you'll find it. We're updating it, and we're underway right now. We're going to get some more information on there within the next few weeks.
If you get more information about the treasure, when do you think that hunt will be taken underway?
I think with the conditions, the way things are, and the gentleman saying this is getting close to the end times, if it's true, and I believe it is, I think it will be within the next 3 years.
Will you update us when you get out there?
I would love to.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Always good having you on the program.
Thank you, sir.
Jim Barfield, the Copper Scroll Project, Finding the Treasures of the Tabernacle. This would be amazing, to find the treasures of King Solomon, that he says is worth billions and billions of dollars.